Hey guys, tonight we're settling down into the strangest bedtime story in the history of bedtime stories. How pirates actually slept while the most powerful navy on Earth was actively hunting them down. Not the swashbuckling version, not the treasure map version, the real one, where sleep was a tactical decision, where your bed was a strip of canvas slung 18 inches from a stranger's elbow, where the ship's own written rules included a clause about exactly what time the candles had to go out, and where somewhere out on a black, moonless horizon, a 50-gun frigate might already be closing the distance while you dreamed. Welcome aboard, because tonight we're not chasing gold, we're chasing something quieter, the 4-hour watch, the groan of a hull working against its ropes, the particular hard-won stillness a hunted man had to learn to call rest. Go ahead and dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe let a fan hum low in the corner of the room, not quite the ocean, but close enough. Let it stand in for wind moving through rigging, for water sliding along old wood, for that low, salty, below decks kind of white noise. You're warm right now. You're on solid ground, under a roof no cannon has ever been aimed at, in a bed that isn't rocking and never has been shot at. That won't be true where we're going tonight. So get comfortable, let your eyes get heavy, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, out past the harbour lights, into the long, watchful dark. Somewhere off a nameless quay, a lookout is rubbing his eyes and telling himself the shape on the horizon is just a cloud bank. It probably is. Probably you've just come off watch, and every muscle in your back is telling you so. The rope netting beneath your hammock creaks as you settle into it, and the first thing you notice isn't the ache, it's the smell. Tar, brine, unwashed wool, and under all of it, the sweet rot smell of a bilge that hasn't been pumped dry in 3 days. It's not pleasant. It is, however, familiar, and on a ship, familiar is close enough to comfort to matter. You close your eyes. 4 hours. That's the deal. 4 hours of your life, uninterrupted, before the world asks anything else of you. It does not get to keep that promise. Somewhere in the second hour, a hand closes on your shoulder and shakes, not gently. Up, says a low voice you know. Sail spotted. Could be nothing. Captain wants hands ready regardless. That's the arithmetic of sleeping on a pirate ship hunted by the Royal Navy. Your rest is real, but it's conditional, and the condition can be revoked at any second by a smudge on the horizon that turns out to be a cloud, a whale, or, on a bad night, exactly what you feared. On most 18th century sailing vessels, crews were divided into 2 watches, and each watch stood 4 hours on. 4 hours off, around the clock, with one clever adjustment called the dog watch. 2 shortened 2-hour shifts in the early evening specifically, so the same men weren't stuck with the worst hours every single night. It sounds almost humane. It was designed that way on purpose, which tells you something, even in a system built entirely around depriving you of sleep. Someone eventually did the math and realized totally exhausted men make worse pirates. Here's the thing though, a naval crew of 300 men could absorb that rotation more comfortably than a pirate sloop running with 60. Fewer hands means each of those hands works harder, rests less, and gets shaken awake more often by watches too thin to cover themselves. Congratulations, you signed the articles. Nobody said the articles included 8 consecutive hours of sleep. The man doing the shaking tonight is Cassius Okafor, and if you're going to survive this voyage with any part of your sanity intact, you'll want to know him. Cass came aboard 11 months ago the way a fair number of pirate crewmen did in this period, not chained in a hold, but voted in, after his previous vessel, a merchant sloop running out of Barbados, was taken as a prize, and its crew given the choice pirate captains often extended to enslaved and formerly enslaved sailors, sign the articles, take an equal share, sail as a free man under a black flag instead of a slaver's colours. It wasn't universal decency. Pirate crews still varied wildly in how they treated captured black sailors, and plenty of ships kept men in bondage regardless of the flag flying above them. But on this ship, on this crew, Cass signed, and within 4 months the crew voted him quartermaster. the second most powerful man aboard, in charge of discipline, of divvying the plunder, and, tonight, of deciding whether that smudge on the horizon is worth losing everyone's sleep over. He carries a single cowrie shell on a cord at his neck, worn smooth from years of thumbing it in idle moments, and he has a habit, small, specific, the kind of thing you only notice after months at sea together, of tapping it twice against his teeth before he gives an order he's not fully certain of. He's tapping it now. That's the setup for tonight. Not one long, unbroken sleep, but a whole system of interruptions, rotations, and false alarms, standing between you and anything resembling rest. And the smudge on the horizon hasn't resolved into a shape yet. Whatever it is, it's getting closer. The watch system itself is worth understanding before you spend another night trying to sleep inside it. Because it wasn't handed down from some naval rulebook, on a pirate ship, it was voted on, the same way almost everything else was. Merchant and naval vessels of the early 1700s ran a fairly rigid two-watch system, but pirate crews, bound by written articles that most of the crew had a hand in drafting and every man aboard was required to sign, often adjusted the schedule to fit the size and temperament of the crew that had to live inside it. Some ships split into 3 watches instead of 2, trading a slightly longer rotation for slightly more actual sleep per man. A trader crew running from the Royal Navy might make gladly, since a rested lookout spots a topsail on the horizon faster than an exhausted one. The catch, and there's always a catch, is that 3 watches only works if you have the bodies to fill them, and pirate crews bled numbers constantly, to battle, to disease, to men peeling off to try their luck ashore with a pardon. A ship that started a voyage with 3 tidy watches could easily be back down to 2 within a season, which meant the men who remained simply absorbed the difference. Hour by unslept hour. Here's what almost nobody puts in the treasure map version of this story. Sleep deprivation on a hunted ship wasn't a side effect. It was baked into the entire strategic posture. A pirate vessel survived by outsailing, outmanoeuvring, and outlasting Navy ships that were, ship for ship, almost always better armed and better crewed. That meant running at night when possible, changing course under cover of darkness, and keeping a lookout posted at the masthead in conditions that would have any modern workplace safety inspector fainting. A man perched on a swaying platform 60, 80, sometimes 100 feet above a pitching deck, expected to distinguish a warship's topsails from a rain squall in starlight. For hours, on maybe 3 hours of broken sleep. From that height, on a clear day, a trained eye could pick out a ship's sails from something like 7 to 10 nautical miles away, your entire margin of safety, distilled down to how alert one exhausted man could stay, while everyone else below him tried to catch what rest they could. And that's just the start of it. The masthead itself deserves a moment, because it's a genuinely strange place to entrust your continued existence to. The climb alone, up ratlines strung between the shrouds, swaying with the ship's roll, in the dark, sometimes in rain that turns tarred rope into something closer to an eel, took a fit man several minutes and no small amount of nerve. Once up there, the lookout perched on a small wooden platform called the crosstrees, or simply braced against the mast itself, with nothing but a length of line lashed loosely around his waist standing between him and a fall that would very likely be fatal on the deck below. Naval logs from the period record men lost overboard from aloft with grim regularity, and it's not hard to understand why. Ask a human body to stay perfectly balanced, perfectly alert, for a 4-hour watch, after weeks of broken sleep, 80 feet above a moving deck, and sooner or later the body is going to lose that argument. Some crews solved part of the problem the way tired people have solved it for centuries, by doubling up. 2 men aloft instead of 1, taking turns actually scanning the horizon while the other rested his eyes for 10 minutes at a stretch. An informal buddy system nobody wrote into any article, but that shows up, again and again, in survivors' later accounts as simply how it was done on a well-run ship. It's the pirate version of trading off who drives on a long car trip. Accept the stakes if you both nod off, are considerably higher than missing your exit. By your second week running from a Navy sloop that had been sighted twice near your last anchorage, sleep stopped being something you did and became something you managed. The way you'd manage water or gunpowder carefully in rationed amounts, never quite enough. You learn to sleep sitting upright against a gun carriage during a lull, boots still on, weapon within reach, because the alternative is fully undressing for a hammock you might be yanked out of within the hour. You learn to trust the particular rhythm of Cass's voice when he wakes you. Low and even means routine, sharp and clipped means it isn't, before your eyes have even opened. This is not the sleep of a man secure in his bed, it's the sleep of a man who has made peace with being interrupted, which, if you think about it, might be the single strangest skill this entire way of life demanded of you. There's a version of this exhaustion that has nothing to do with the Royal Navy at all, and it arrives in the form of weather rather than sails. A squall rolling in at 2 a.m. doesn't care that you are finally deeply asleep for the first time in 4 days. The deck pitches, water comes over the rail in sheets, and every hand not already on watch is roused to reef sail or man the pumps before the ship takes on more water than she can shed. Storms like this were, if anything, a more reliable disruptor of sleep than any Navy chase, because they came without warning a lookout could give, and demanded every available body regardless of whose watch it technically was. You learn to read the ship herself for warning signs the way an experienced hand does. The particular groan of a mast under strain, the change in pitch as swells build beneath the hull, the smell of ozone in the air before a real blow arrives, because a ship that talks to you in her creaking, working timbers is a ship that gives you a few extra minutes to brace before the worst of it hits. It's not a comfortable kind of listening. It becomes, over enough nights, an almost unconscious one. 3 nights later, the smudge from the first night finally resolves, and it's nothing. A fishing ketch running dark to avoid its own troubles, not a warship at all. The relief that floods through the deck is almost funny in its intensity. Grown men who make their living robbing merchant vessels at gunpoint let out a breath like children checking under the bed. But the false alarm has cost you something real. An entire watch's worth of sleep, adrenaline that takes hours to fully drain out of the body, and a night where, instead of resting, 40 men stood at their stations bracing for a fight that never came. Multiply that by every week of a voyage, and you start to understand why exhaustion, not gunfire, was often the thing that actually broke a pirate crew's nerve. A cannon shot is quick. 3 months of interrupted sleep is a much slower kind of siege, and it's the one almost nobody talks about. Within a month of that first false alarm, the pattern repeats itself so often it stops even registering as unusual, which is its own kind of danger. A ship's log from a Royal Navy sloop of war patrolling the Bahamas in this exact period recorded chasing 3 separate suspicious sail that all turned out to be innocent traders. Each pursuit costing the Navy crew the same kind of sleep it cost the pirates hiding from them. Here's the thing nobody puts on the flag. Everybody on both sides of this hunt was tired. The Navy men chasing you were standing their own broken watches, squinting at their own smudges on the horizon, losing their own hours of sleep to ships that turned out to be nothing. It's the pirate version of 2 exhausted neighbours, both convinced the other one is about to break into their house, except one of those houses has cannons, and neither one is getting a full night's sleep until this is over. Some captains tried to manage that exhaustion the same way they managed rationed water or powder, by writing rest directly into the ship's schedule of signals. Rather than a loud bell to mark the changing of the watch, a sound that could carry for miles across still water on a quiet night and hand your position to anyone listening, some crews adopted quieter methods after dark when running from pursuit. A low whistle, a hand passed man to man down the length of the deck, the watch changing in something close to silence. It's a small operational detail, easy to miss, but it tells you how seriously a hunted crew took the idea that even the sound of your own rest schedule could get you killed. You learn the silent handoff within your first month, the same way you learn every other unglamorous survival skill out here, by watching someone do it once, badly, and getting corrected. You anchor that night in a channel so shallow your own quartermaster paces the rail, checking the depth by eye. Because a Navy frigate simply cannot follow you here. Its hull draws too much water, and running it aground on a falling tide would be its own kind of disaster for a captain answering to the Admiralty. It's not comfort exactly. Sleeping in 8 feet of water with mangrove roots close enough to touch on either side, mosquitoes finding every inch of exposed skin, the air thick and still and biting. But it's safety, of a specific and hard-won kind, and Cass taps his shell against his teeth one last time before finally, for the first time in 9 days, letting himself sleep through an entire watch he isn't standing. What happens the first time that safety fails is a different story, one this ship will live through before the voyage is done. But that's not tonight. Word travels strangely out here, second-hand and salt-worn by the time it reaches you. It's a local wrecker, a man who makes his living picking apart ships that founder on the reefs nearby, friendly enough with crews like yours to trade information for a cut of the take, who rows out at dusk to tell Cass what he saw 2 days back. A 50-gun ship, flying no colours he recognised at first, working slowly along the coast about 15 leagues south, clearly searching for something. Cass relays it to the captain in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who has learned that panic spreads faster than any actual danger does. By the time it reaches you, second-hand from a bunkmate who heard it from someone else entirely, the 50 guns have become 60. And the ship has grown a second consort trailing behind it. This is how information moved on a hunted ship, not in clean briefings, but the way gossip moves through any small, frightened community, gathering detail and losing accuracy in roughly equal measure with every retelling. You learn, eventually, to trust the version that came from Cass directly, and discount everything after the second or third relay. It's not a perfect system. It's the only one you've got. It's 6 weeks into the voyage when Cass takes a splinter of oak the size of a finger through the meat of his forearm during a skirmish with a merchant sloop that fought back harder than expected. A wound that, on land, would mean a week in bed and a doctor's bill. Out here, the ship's makeshift surgeon packs it, stitches it by lantern light with Cass gripping a rolled strip of leather between his teeth, and within 4 days Cass is back on deck, arm bound tight against his chest, tapping his shell against his teeth with his good hand out of sheer habit. What softens the blow, and it does soften it, genuinely, is the article every man aboard signed before this voyage began. Injuries suffered in the ship's service are compensated from the common stock before the plunder is divided. Historical accounts of pirate articles from this era, Bartholomew Roberts' Crew's rules among the most cited, though it's worth saying plainly that our clearest record of them comes down to us through Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 history, a source that mixed documented fact with dramatised invention freely enough that historians treat its specific figures with real caution. Describe compensation scales running as high as 800 pieces of 8 for the loss of a leg or an arm, sometimes less for an eye or a finger, paid out before any other man aboard took his cut. Whether the precise number was 800 pieces of 8 on any given ship is exactly the kind of detail that can't be verified with total confidence. What's much better documented, across multiple crews and multiple sets of articles that survive independently of Johnson, is the underlying principle a man hurt in the ship's service was owed something, in writing, agreed to in advance, by every hand aboard. For a wounded sailor on a merchant vessel of the period, that kind of guarantee simply didn't exist. Cass doesn't get a full night's rest for nearly 2 weeks after the injury, arm throbbing every time the ship rolls, but he gets that, and on a ship where almost nothing else was guaranteed, it mattered more than it might sound like it should. The articles reach into your sleep in smaller ways too, and this is the part almost nobody expects. Several surviving sets of pirate articles from this period include a clause requiring lights and candles to be extinguished by a set hour each night, with any man wanting to keep drinking or gambling past that point required to do it up on the open deck rather than below, specifically so it didn't disturb the rest of men trying to sleep in the crowded space below decks. Read that again, pirates, men whose entire profession involved armed robbery on the open ocean, wrote themselves a bedtime rule, enforced by vote and by their own quartermaster, because sleep was valuable enough to protect by law. It's almost funny, framed that way. The pirate version of a noise complaint, except the penalty for ignoring it wasn't a fine from your homeowners association. It was Cass Okafor standing over your hammock at midnight, tapping his shell, telling you to take the dice game up top or lose your night's grog ration. Rum itself cuts both ways here. A top before sleep eased the ache of a body worked raw all day, but too much of it left a man groggy and slow exactly when a sudden alarm demanded speed, which is likely part of why so many crews regulated its consumption in writing rather than leaving it to chance. By the time false dawn starts bleeding grey along the eastern edge of the sky, you've been awake, on and off, for the better part of 3 watches, and the relief of a clean handoff, the next man climbing groggily out of his hammock to take your place, the simple, physical fact of being allowed to lie down without anyone expecting anything more of you for the next 4 hours feels disproportionate to how small a thing it actually is. But that's the whole point of it. On a ship built around constant vigilance, constant readiness, constant risk of a fight you didn't choose the timing of, the vote that gave you a rotation at all, however imperfect, was more say over your own fate than almost any sailor serving the crown could claim. A pressed man on a Navy warship didn't get a vote on his watch schedule. You did. It's a small thing to hang hope on. Out here, small things are most of what you get. What happens the night the alarm turns out to be real, not a fishing catch, not a whale breaching in the dark, not nerves, is a different story, and it belongs later in this voyage. For now the watch changes, the sun comes up grey and then gold over water that, for one more morning, holds nothing more dangerous than the boat you're already standing on, and somewhere below, Cass Okafor finally, briefly, sleeps. The candles are barely out below decks before the story shifts. From the anonymous churn of watch and rotation to one man whose relationship with sleep, or the lack of it, became almost as notorious as his flag. There is a moment, in early February of 1722, off a stretch of West African coast near Cape Lopez, when the deck of the Royal Fortune is a wall of smoke and splinters, and the man who has spent 3 years making the Royal Navy look slow and foolish across 2 oceans is dying on it. Bartholomew Roberts, dressed by multiple accounts from men who survived that morning, in a crimson waistcoat and a feathered hat, a gold chain looped twice around his neck with a diamond cross hanging from it, is struck in the throat by grape shot fired from His Majesty's ship Swallow, and falls and does not get back up. His crew, following an order he is reported to have given before the engagement even began, weight his body and slide it over the side into the water rather than let it be taken as a trophy. It's one of the strangest deaths in the entire Golden Age of Piracy, not because of how it happened, but because of everything it interrupted, because Bartholomew Roberts, of all the men who ever sailed under a black flag, had built his entire career on almost never staying still long enough to be caught. This is the story of the Royal Fortune, or more precisely, of the several ships that carried that name across Roberts' career, and of the punishing, restless rhythm their captain imposed on everyone aboard in the name of never being where the Navy expected him to be. To understand why Roberts died surprised, genuinely by most accounts caught with his ship in poor sailing trim, undermanned on deck, half his crew still recovering from a night ashore, you have to understand a man whose entire reputation was built on the opposite of being caught unprepared. Roberts came to piracy almost by accident, in a way that historians still find slightly startling given what he became. Born in Wales around 1682, he was working as third mate aboard a slave ship, the Princess, off the coast of West Africa in June 1719, when pirates captured the vessel and, as was common practice, offered the crew the choice to join. By several accounts, Roberts was reluctant at first. A career sailor with no particular romance about outlawry, but within 6 weeks of his capture, the pirate captain who'd taken him was killed in a raid, and the crew, in the same democratic process that governed nearly every pirate ship of the era, voted Roberts into command. His reported response, that having dipped his hands in muddy water he might as well be a captain as a common man, has been repeated so often it's practically folklore at this point, and it comes to us worth flagging plainly through Captain Charles Johnson's General History, a source whose specific quotation should always be read as legend adjacent rather than verified transcript. What we can verify with much greater confidence from Admiralty correspondence, colonial governors' letters, and trial records is what came next. In roughly 2.5 years of active piracy, Roberts's crews captured somewhere in the range of 400 vessels, an almost unbelievable figure that made him, by most modern estimates, the most successful pirate of the entire era in terms of ships taken. The waters Roberts hunted in were not incidental to his story either, and they're worth sitting with for a moment, because the same West African coastline that made him rich was also the coastline that had carried Cass 3 chapters ago in this same story, across the Atlantic under very different circumstances. Roberts' operations off Africa in 1721 and 1722 frequently targeted slave ships directly, including the very vessel he'd been serving aboard when he was first taken, a detail that sits uneasily alongside any romanticised image of piracy as a form of rough justice, since captured Africans aboard those ships were, depending on the crew and the moment, sometimes freed and sometimes simply treated as part of the plunder to be sold or kept, regardless of the flag now flying above them. It's an important, unglamorous complication to hold on to, rather than smooth over. The same system of votes and articles that gave men like Cass a genuine path to freedom on some crews offered no guarantee at all on others, and Roberts's own fleet is documented, across multiple sources, as having behaved inconsistently on exactly this question from one captured ship to the next. Here's what almost no version of Roberts' story spends enough time on: the sheer, punishing mobility required to pull off 400 captures in under 3 years. Roberts' ships ranged across the Caribbean, up the eastern seaboard of North America, and across the Atlantic to the West African coast, a geographic sprawl that dwarfs almost every other pirate captain of the period, most of whom worked a single familiar stretch of water. Colonial governors from Virginia to Barbados wrote increasingly panicked letters to London describing sightings of Roberts's ships in locations that by any reasonable sailing time shouldn't have been possible weeks apart. That mobility wasn't free. It came directly out of his crew's hides, in the form of a punishing operational tempo that left almost no room for the kind of settled, predictable rest a Navy crew on a fixed patrol route might expect. Roberts' ships rarely anchored in the same waters twice, rarely lingered anywhere long enough to be pinned down, and by several accounts Roberts himself kept unusually regular, almost austere personal habits for a pirate captain, reportedly favouring tea over rum, keeping to a strict schedule, and expecting a similar discipline from the men around him, which again comes to us largely through Johnson and should be weighed accordingly. What's better attested is the pattern of movement itself, traced through Navy dispatches that consistently arrived a step behind wherever Roberts had actually been. There's a specific piece of this discipline worth dwelling on, because it circles right back to everything the previous chapter of this story already covered. Johnson's account of Roberts' articles, again, treat the exact wording with appropriate caution, describes a clause requiring musicians aboard the ship to rest on the Sabbath, playing only by special request the rest of the week, framed as a small concession to the crew's own comfort rather than constant, on-demand entertainment. Whether that specific clause existed exactly as recorded or not, the broader pattern it reflects is well attested across multiple independent sets of surviving articles. Pirate crews wrote rules protecting rest and routine into their own governing documents again and again, across ships and years and oceans, because men who expected to fight, flee, and outlast a much larger navy for years at a stretch understood, in a way modern management theory would eventually rediscover, that a completely depleted crew is a crew that loses. By the time Roberts' fleet, by 1721, he was operating with multiple ships, sometimes 3 or 4 sailing together, arrived off the West African coast in the final months of his life. That restless mobility had become both his greatest weapon and, in a strange way, his crew's greatest exhaustion. A fleet moving that constantly required lookouts posted at all hours across multiple ships coordinated signals between vessels, and a captain whose entire strategic identity depended on his crew's ability to weigh anchor and be gone before any pursuer closed the distance. Sleep on Robert's ships existed entirely within the margins that mobility allowed, and by early 1722, those margins had grown dangerously thin. Robert's relationship to his own ships is worth pausing on, because it says something about how he thought of mobility as almost a piece of identity rather than mere tactics. Across his career, Roberts commanded at least 3 separate vessels he named, in turn Royal Fortune, a captured slaver refitted and rechristened, then a larger prize taken later and renamed the same thing, then finally the ship that would carry him to Cape Lopez. It's a small, strange habit, renaming ship after ship with the same name, but it tracks with everything else about him. The identity mattered more than the hull underneath it, because the hull was always temporarily borrowed, always about to be swapped for something faster or better armed the moment the opportunity arose. A captain that attached to his ship's particular timbers might have hesitated to abandon a slower vessel for a faster prize. Roberts, by every account, never hesitated. The waters where Roberts spent his final year were also thick with the infrastructure of the transatlantic slave trade in a way that shaped almost every aspect of his operation, whether he intended it to or not. The Royal African Company maintained a string of fortified trading posts along the Gold Coast specifically to protect and provision slave ships moving through these waters, and Roberts's fleet, hunting in the same shipping lanes those forts existed to secure, forced the company and the colonial authorities behind it into an increasingly urgent correspondence, with London demanding naval protection. It's this pressure, building for the better part of a year before Challoner Ogle ever sighted the Royal Fortune, that eventually got the Swallow dispatched to the African coast in the first place, meaning Roberts' own success at disrupting the very trade route that had first brought him there as an unwilling third mate is, in a very direct sense, what finally summoned the ship that killed him. That summons very nearly failed once already, months before the engagement that actually took him. Colonial correspondence from late 1721 describes at least one earlier close call when a Royal Navy vessel patrolling near Principe Island came within sight of part of Roberts' fleet, only to lose them again in a squall overnight. The kind of near miss that, replayed enough times, breeds a very specific, dangerous kind of confidence in the crew that keeps getting away with it. Here's the thing about running successfully for 3 straight years. It doesn't just wear a crew down physically, the way this whole night has been describing. It also, slowly and almost invisibly, erodes the fear that kept everyone disciplined in the first place. A crew that's escaped a dozen near misses starts to believe, on some half-conscious level, that they always will. Robert's crew, by the final weeks of 1721, had every reason in the historical record to believe exactly that. Johnson's history attributes to Roberts one further line worth including here, with the same caution owed to every other quotation from that source, asked. According to the account about the dangers of the trade he'd chosen, Roberts is reported to have summed up his own philosophy as a preference for a merry life and a short one over the alternative, a long, hungry, poorly paid career before the mast on someone else's ship, whether he said it in exactly those words or not. The sentiment tracks with the documented shape of his career well enough that historians generally treat it as broadly consistent with how Roberts approached the trade, even while flagging the precise wording as unverifiable. It's a genuinely bleak piece of arithmetic when you sit with it, a man who had, by the numbers, more reason than almost anyone in this story to value his own survival, choosing instead to treat the shortness of the life as simply the price of the merriness. The eyewitness account that survives from that final morning comes largely from crew members captured after the battle and later deposed at trial in Cape Coast Castle, men with obvious motive to shape their testimony in whatever way might save their own necks, which is worth remembering even as their account remains the closest thing we have to a first-hand record. What multiple depositions agree on is this. The night before the engagement, Robert's crew had taken a French vessel and spent much of the night celebrating aboard it, with a meaningful portion of the Royal Fortune's crew still absent from their own ship, or groggy from the previous night's drink, when the lookout finally spotted Swallow approaching under Captain Challoner Ogle. Ogle, in a manoeuvre that would become one of the most consequential pieces of naval deception in the entire war against piracy, had disguised his warship to look like a merchant vessel from a distance, furling sail in a way meant to mimic a slower trading ship, keeping his gunports concealed, deliberately shaping the Swallow's silhouette to look like exactly the kind of easy prize a hunted. Hungry crew would sail toward rather than away from. What happened next unfolded fast enough that Roberts' famous discipline had almost no time to matter. Multiple crew depositions describe confusion on deck as the Royal Fortune's helmsman, in the chaos, ran the ship badly off its best sailing line just as the true nature of the Swallow became apparent, costing the pirates precious minutes and manoeuvring room they could not afford to lose. Roberts himself, according to the account most consistently repeated across surviving testimony, came up on deck still dressed for the previous night's celebration rather than for battle, the crimson coat, the gold chain, the plume. A detail almost too on the nose to be entirely comfortable with, but one that multiple independent witnesses describe with enough consistency that historians generally accept it as broadly accurate, even while treating the more theatrical flourishes with caution. The engagement itself lasted less than 2 hours. The Swallow's first broadside, fired at close range, tore through the Royal Fortune's deck and struck Roberts directly, killing him almost instantly. A death so sudden that by most accounts, a meaningful portion of his own crew didn't immediately grasp that their captain was gone. What followed was less a battle than a rout. The Royal Fortune's crew, deprived in a single moment of the man whose relentless mobility had kept them ahead of exactly this outcome for 3 years, struck their colours and surrendered within the hour. The aftermath is where the story turns from tactical to genuinely grim, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Roberts' surviving crew, 272 men by the most commonly cited count from the trial records, were taken to Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast and put through one of the largest piracy trials in British colonial history. 52 of them were hanged in April 1722, in a mass execution spread across several days specifically so as not to overwhelm the local gallows or the appetite of the crowds gathered to watch. Dozens more were sentenced to indentured labour in African gold mines, a sentence some historians consider functionally as lethal as the noose, given conditions there. A smaller number, mostly men who could demonstrate they'd been forced into piracy against their will, were acquitted. It remains, by most accounts, the largest single piracy trial and execution of the entire Golden Age, the direct brutal consequence of one morning when the man who had built his entire reputation on never being caught unprepared was. Challoner Ogle himself walked away from Cape Lopez with the kind of reward that stands in sharp, almost uncomfortable contrast to everything the rest of this story has described about exhausted, undercompensated hunters and hunted alike. For successfully ending the career of the most prolific pirate captain of the entire Golden Age, Ogle was knighted upon his return to England, the only Royal Navy officer to receive that specific honour for actions taken against piracy during this whole era, a detail that tells you plainly how much weight the Crown placed on finally, publicly closing the book on Bartholomew Roberts. It's worth noting, in fairness to every exhausted lookout and every underpaid Navy crew this story has already described, that Ogle's own men saw comparatively little of that glory trickle down to them, prize money and recognition flowing overwhelmingly toward the captain whose name went into the history books. The trial at Cape Coast Castle turned, for many of the accused, on a single central question: had a man signed the pirate articles freely, or had he been forced aboard against his will and kept only through threat and circumstance? The distinction mattered enormously, since forced men who could demonstrate they'd taken no active, voluntary part in the piracy stood a real chance of acquittal, while volunteers faced the noose or the mines with little room for appeal. Surviving trial records describe witnesses, sometimes captured merchant captains whose own ships Roberts' fleet had taken, brought in specifically to testify, recalling which men among the accused had fought willingly during boardings and which had hung back, worked only under direct threat, or actively tried to protect a captured vessel's crew from the worst of it. It's a grim, high-stakes version of exactly the kind of communal reputation this whole story has already touched on. The same network of eyewitness relay that carried word of Navy sightings between wreckers and quartermasters now decided, in a colonial courtroom, which of Robert's 272 surviving men would hang and which would go free. There's a version of this story that plays Roberts's death as almost farcical, the meticulous captain undone by his own crew's night of drinking. It's a satisfying shape for a story to take, and there's real evidence behind it. But it's worth resisting the urge to make it purely ironic, because underneath the irony is something closer to tragedy: 3 years of a punishing. Near constant operational tempo, 3 years of a crew kept perpetually mobile and perpetually undersupplied on rest, finally meeting a single morning where exhaustion, celebration, and bad luck lined up at exactly the wrong moment. This is the story of the Royal Fortune, the ship, and the captain that outran the Royal Navy for longer than almost anyone else in this entire era. Until, for one catastrophic morning, it couldn't. Roberts flew more than one flag across his career, and the specific imagery on at least one of them survives well enough in colonial correspondence to be treated as reasonably solid fact rather than legend, a black banner showing his own figure standing atop 2 skulls, each marked with initials understood at the time to stand for the governors of Barbados and Martinique. The 2 colonial officials who had, by that point, sent ships specifically to hunt him down. It's a small, pointed piece of psychological theatre, not unlike the burning fuses Blackbeard would later tuck under his own hat brim, except aimed at 2 named men rather than at fear in the abstract. A flag that functioned less as a generic symbol of piracy and more as a personal, specific message to the 2 officials Roberts considered his most dedicated pursuers. Object and system both, in the way this whole story has kept circling back to, a piece of cloth doing the work of intimidation that a much larger crew might otherwise have had to do with cannon fire. What Roberts' death left behind, beyond the trial and the gallows, was a kind of proof of concept for the Navy. Evidence that even the most successful, most mobile pirate operation of the age could be undone not by matching its speed, but by catching it asleep. Every hunted crew that came after him, whether they knew Roberts' specific story or not, inherited the lesson written into it. The sea doesn't forgive a tired watch, and neither does a warship dressed up as a merchantman. The lesson didn't stay confined to open water. Sometimes the search for rest led a crew not toward deeper sea, but into water so shallow it barely deserved the name, and that search had its own dangers, patient and slow-moving, entirely its own. You smell the mud before you see the anchorage, a thick, green, low-tide smell of mangrove root and decaying leaf litter, utterly unlike the clean salt smell of open water, and after weeks at sea it hits you almost like a wall, thick enough to taste at the back of your throat. The ship has slowed to a crawl, sails half furled, a man at the bow calling depth in a steady, unhurried chant as you thread into a channel barely wider than the ship itself. This isn't leisure. This is the single most important tactical decision your captain will make all voyage, and it's happening at the pace of a funeral procession, because a keel scraped on a hidden sandbar here means the whole desperate plan falls apart. Here's the arithmetic nobody explains clearly enough. A Royal Navy frigate of this period, a proper fighting ship carrying 30 guns or more, typically drew somewhere between 14 and 18 feet of water, meaning the hull needed that much depth beneath it just to float without grounding, a fact every Navy captain understood as well as any pirate did. A pirate sloop, by contrast, especially one deliberately chosen or refitted for speed and shallow water work, could draw as little as 6 to 8 feet. That 6 to 10 foot gap is not a technical detail. It is, quite literally, the difference between a place where you can sleep safely and a place where you cannot, because it defines the entire category of water the Royal Navy's biggest, most dangerous ships simply cannot follow you into. Every hidden cove, every mangrove-choked inlet, every skinny channel behind a barrier reef is, functionally, a room the Navy isn't allowed to enter, not because of law, but because of physics. Welcome to the pirate version of a panic room, except this one requires a skilled navigator, an intimate knowledge of local waters most captains spent years accumulating, and a great deal of nerve from whoever's calling depth at the bow. The bad news is that shallow water buys you safety from cannons and steals it right back in a different form, in a trade that never quite balances in your favour. The ship needs this stop for more than hiding, she needs it for survival of an entirely different kind, and that reason has been quietly working against you the entire voyage without you ever seeing it happen. In warm tropical and subtropical waters, wooden hulls are under constant, invisible assault from Teredo navalis, commonly called shipworm, though it's not a worm at all but a small wood-boring saltwater clam, which bores into submerged timber and can riddle a hull with tunnels in a matter of months, weakening the wood enough to threaten the ship's structural integrity and in bad enough cases, its ability to stay afloat at all. Left unchecked, an infested hull could be reduced to something resembling a wooden sponge within a single season in the warmest waters. That's why, roughly every 4 to 6 months depending on conditions, a ship working these waters has to be careened, deliberately beached and tipped onto its side at low tide, so the crew can scrape the hull clean of worm damage, barnacles and weed, and patch what needs patching, before the tide comes back in and lets her float upright again. Careening is where the real vulnerability lives, and it's worth sitting with just how exposed it leaves everyone, for the days it takes, sometimes as long as a week. Depending on how bad the damage is and how many hands are available, your ship is not a ship at all in any functional sense. She's on her side in the mud, guns unmounted or shifted for balance, rigging slack, entirely unable to fight, flee, or do anything except sit there while dozens of exhausted men scrape barnacles off her hull with hand tools under a punishing sun. The crew doesn't sleep aboard during this. There's nowhere flat enough to sling a hammock on a ship canted 30 degrees onto her side, so you sleep ashore instead in makeshift camps of canvas and palm fronds on solid ground for the first time in months. Which sounds almost pleasant until you remember that solid ground also means no water between you and whatever might be walking toward your camp in the dark. The ship's carpenter, a broad quiet man named Elias Corse, who forced men new to the crew, learned to fear and respect in roughly equal measure, oversees the actual work of careening. And it's worth pausing on him for a moment, because his trade is one of the least glamorous and most essential aboard any hunted vessel. A ship's carpenter of this era was expected not just to build and repair, but to diagnose, to read the specific groan of a strained plank, to know by touch and smell whether a patch of hullwood had gone soft with rot or riddled with worm, to keep a running mental inventory of every weak point in a ship that might, at any hour, need to outrun something faster than she was ever designed to. Corse sleeps less than almost anyone aboard during a careening, not because anyone's ordered it, but because a hull half repaired at dawn is a hull nobody trusts enough to relax around, least of all the man responsible for it. Not every hull cleaning stop went as far as a full careening, and it's worth knowing the difference, because the choice between them was itself a calculation about how much risk a crew could stomach at any given moment. A full careening, unloading guns, stores and ballast, then hauling the ship over onto her side with block and tackle until her keel showed clear of the water, was thorough but slow, sometimes stretching past a week, and left the ship in the most vulnerable state she could possibly be in. A quicker alternative, sometimes called grounding or heeling, involved beaching at low tide and tipping the ship only partway, scraping and patching whatever portion of the hull came clear without fully disarming her, sacrificing thoroughness for speed. A captain who'd had word of a Navy patrol working nearby, the way yours has, might choose the faster, sloppier option specifically to minimise the number of days spent helpless. A worse hull for a shorter window of danger, a trade that made grim sense when the alternative was being caught fully dismantled. The actual technique for stripping a hull clean carried its own name and its own small ritual, one that predates careening by a considerable stretch and that sailors of this era still swore by: breaming, in which reeds, furs or other dry brush were piled against the exposed hull and set alight, the heat and flame scorching off the worst of the marine growth and killing shipworm larvae in the wood before the scraping even began. It's a strange thing to picture, a ship laid on her side in the mud, deliberately set partially ablaze by her own crew, but it worked, and worked well enough that it remained standard practice for wooden ships throughout this entire era. The smell of scorched, tarred wood mixes with the mangrove mud smell of the anchorage itself, and by the second day of it your clothes, your hair, everything you own smells like a controlled burn that never quite got fully controlled. The labour itself sorts the crew by something closer to necessity than rank, which is its own small, telling detail about how a pirate ship actually organised itself under pressure. Officers and quartermaster alike take a turn with a scraper in hand during a careening, because the job simply requires more bodies than any crew can spare from the work. A contrast worth noting against naval practice of the period, where officers directed labour rather than performing it themselves. Cass Okafor, arm fully healed by now, spends a full day scraping alongside the newest, lowest-ranked forced men on the crew, and if there's resentment in it, nobody voices it where you can hear, which tells you something about how thoroughly the shared voted-on structure of this life had displaced the rigid hierarchies most of these men had grown up under on merchant and naval decks alike. Knowing where to bring a ship for this whole vulnerable process in the first place wasn't a skill any captain simply possessed on his own. It was accumulated, borrowed and traded, the same way information about Navy sightings moved through the informal network of wreckers and fishermen this story has already described. The logwood camps scattered along the coast of the Bay of Campeche and the Mosquito Coast, worked by loggers cutting the dyewood that fed Europe's textile trade, maintained their own long, complicated relationship with pirate crews, sometimes hostile, more often quietly accommodating. Since a logging camp's isolated, semi-lawless existence had more in common with a pirate crew's own circumstances than with any formal colonial settlement. A captain who'd spent years in these waters accumulated a mental chart of a dozen such places, weighing which coves offered good holding ground against which had friendly enough locals to warn of trouble, against which had simply gone quiet too long and might now be watched. It's a body of knowledge that took years to build and that died, more often than not, with the captain who'd built it, which is part of why a crew losing an experienced captain, the way Robert's crew lost theirs off Cape Lopez, lost something considerably more valuable than just a leader. Before the ship ever commits to a cove like this one, a small party goes ahead of her in the ship's boat to look the place over properly, and it's worth understanding what exactly they're looking for. Not just water depth, though that matters enormously, but signs of recent human presence, old campfire ash gone cold weeks rather than hours ago, footprints in the mud already softened by tide, the absence of fresh-cut branches that would suggest another crew, friendly or otherwise, had beaten you to this particular piece of hidden coastline. A cove that looks empty and a cove that is empty are two different things, and the gap between them has gotten more than one crew killed over the years, surprised by whoever else had already claimed the same shallow, well-hidden water for their own purposes. The scouting party takes its time. Nobody begrudges them the caution. 3 days into the careening at this particular hidden cove off the Hispaniola coast, a local wrecker's boat slides quietly out of the mangroves at dusk. The same informal network of fishermen, small traders, and salvage crews that fed you word of the Navy weeks ago, carrying news that a Navy sloop was spotted working the coast roughly 2 days' sail south, methodically searching coves not unlike this one. This is the arrangement that kept crews like yours alive as often as any weapon did. Coastal communities throughout the Caribbean, the Carolinas and the Bahamas frequently maintained quiet, mutually beneficial relationships with pirate crews, trading information, supplies, and sometimes stolen goods for coin or protection. In a system colonial governors spent enormous energy and largely failed trying to stamp out. The wrecker doesn't stay long, he never does. But the information he leaves behind reshapes the next several nights of everyone's sleep, because now every distant sound from the tree line gets a second look before anyone settles back down. Not every ship caught mid-careen got the warning yours just did. Colonial correspondence from this period records more than one instance of a pirate vessel discovered exactly in this position, beached, disassembled, entirely unable to fight or flee, by a passing Navy patrol or an armed colonial vessel, acting on a tip, the crew forced to either surrender an unsalvageable ship on the spot or abandon her entirely and scatter into the countryside on foot. It's the single most dangerous few days of almost any pirate voyage, precisely because it's also, paradoxically, the few days spent furthest from open water and its familiar dangers. You sleep worse during careening than at almost any other point in the voyage, not because the immediate threat is greater in any given hour, but because the ship herself, your one reliable means of escape, is temporarily useless, and everyone aboard knows it. The false alarm, when it comes 2 nights later, arrives not as a shape on the water, but as a shape in the trees, a young crewman on watch, jumpy after days of half-formed rumour, swearing he saw the glint of a musket barrel in the mangroves and rousing half the camp in a scramble for weapons that ends. 20 tense minutes later, with the discovery that the musket barrel was moonlight on a fallen palm frond. Nobody laughs about it exactly, not with everyone's nerves already frayed thin, but there's a specific exhausted relief in the air afterward, the same relief you felt before when a threat turns out to be nothing, except this time it costs you sleep you can genuinely least afford. In the one stretch of the voyage where the ship herself is least able to protect you if the alarm had been real. There's a written rule for this too, in the articles this crew signed before ever leaving port, and it's a harder-edged one than the lights-out clause from earlier in this voyage: desertion during careening, slipping off into the countryside while the ship lies helpless on her side, was treated by most crews as one of the most severely punished offences in the entire pirate code, more so even than theft from the common stock. The logic is blunt and entirely understandable once you're standing in the middle of it. A crew that's most vulnerable is a crew that most needs every hand it has, and a man who runs at exactly that moment isn't just breaking a rule. He's endangering everyone left behind to finish the work exposed. It's not romantic. It's the pirate version of a fire drill, where walking out mid-drill gets you formally tried by your own crewmates. A full day of scraping and breaming leaves a different kind of exhaustion than the watchful, anxious tiredness this whole story has mostly been describing, and it's worth naming the difference. Hands blister and split against wooden scrapers held for hours at a stretch, backs ache from bending over a hull's curve since before dawn, the constant low smoke from the breaming fires leaves everyone's eyes red and everyone's throat raw by nightfall. It is, by any reasonable measure, brutal labour. And yet, more often than not, sleep comes easier on a night like that than on almost any night spent purely on watch, because physical exhaustion, however punishing, quiets the mind in a way that anxious alertness never quite manages to. You collapse into whatever shelter the camp offers and are asleep within minutes, dreamless and heavy, the specific relief of a body that has simply run out of anything left to give the day. It's a strange, almost backward little mercy tucked into the middle of the most dangerous stretch of the whole voyage. The days that leave you most exposed are, paradoxically, often the nights you actually sleep best. On the 5th night, the sky does the one thing that could make an already precarious situation genuinely dangerous. It darkens fast, wind picking up out of the southeast in the particular, building way that anyone who's spent a season in these waters learns to read as trouble rather than an ordinary evening breeze. A ship on her side, half repaired, cannot ride out a real blow the way a ship afloat and rigged can. She's simply stuck there, exposed timber and open seams facing whatever the weather decides to throw at her, with no ability to run for open water or even shift her position. The camp ashore spends that night doing the only thing available to it, lashing down what can be lashed, moving stores to higher ground and waiting, in canvas shelters that do very little against real wind, for the front to pass. It does pass by early morning, with nothing worse than a soaked camp and a few scattered supplies to show for it, but the particular flavour of helplessness in that night, listening to wind build over a ship that cannot move, over a crew that cannot fight or flee a threat that isn't even the Navy, stays with you longer than the storm itself does. There's a specific, quiet tension that builds across those final 2 days of careening, worth naming before the relaunch itself arrives. Everyone aboard knows, in the back of their mind, that the ship's most dangerous stretch is also nearly over, that in a day, maybe 2, she'll float again, whole and armed and capable of running or fighting as needed. That knowledge doesn't make the final nights ashore any less exposed, but it changes the texture of the waiting, the way the last mile of a long march feels different from the first, even though the ground underfoot hasn't changed at all. You find yourself glancing at the tide charts the sailing master keeps, counting down the hours the same way you might count down a watch, impatient in a way that has nothing to do with boredom and everything to do with wanting your ship back under you. By the 6th day, the hull is scraped clean, patched where it needed patching, and blackened along the waterline with a mixture of tallow, sulphur, and other substances meant to discourage the next round of shipwarm from starting the whole cycle over again, a rough approximation of what would later become copper hull sheathing, decades before that technology existed for most vessels. Relaunching her is its own small ceremony of relief, the whole crew hauling together to work her back upright as the tide comes in, the strange, specific joy of feeling a ship come alive again underneath you after a week of watching her lie helpless in the mud. That night, back aboard, back afloat, back in water deep enough to feel like the ship is truly yours again, sleep comes easier than it has in weeks. Not because the danger is gone, but because, for one night at least, you're back in the one kind of place the Navy's biggest ships genuinely cannot follow. What happens when a crew doesn't get that lucky? When the anchorage they thought was safe turns out to have been watched the whole time, when the wrecker's warning arrives a day too late instead of a day too early, is a story for later, one this same crew hasn't finished living yet. For now the tide is in, the hull is sound, and somewhere behind you the mangroves close back over the space where your camp used to be, keeping their own kind of secret. Not every hunted captain found that kind of safety, or kept it once he had it. Some ran until running itself became the only thing they knew how to do, and the running, in the end, is its own kind of story. Charles Vane is standing on the deck of a captured sloop in the Bahamas in the summer of 1718, watching a squadron of Royal Navy ships enter Nassau Harbour under a new governor's flag, and making, in the space of a few minutes, the decision that will define the rest of his short, restless life. Around him, the harbour is doing something it rarely does, holding still, dozens of pirate vessels riding at anchor in the same shallow, forgiving water that has sheltered them for years, their crews watching the same approaching sails he is, weighing the exact same choice. Most of the pirates crowded into Nassau that summer, a settlement so thoroughly overrun by outlaws that some estimates place its pirate population at close to 1,000 or more at its peak, earning it the nickname the Pirate Republic, awaiting the King's Act of Grace. A royal pardon proclaimed in September 1717, offering surrender and a clean slate to any pirate willing to swear off the trade before a set deadline. Woodes Rogers, the newly appointed governor arriving with that squadron, carries the pardon in his pocket and a mandate in his orders, clean out Nassau, one way or another. Vane's answer to all of it, delivered with a flourish multiple accounts agree on even if the exact staging varies, is to set fire to a captured French ship and send it drifting straight at Rogers' incoming fleet as a parting insult, before slipping out of the harbour entirely under cover of the confusion. This is the story of Charles Vane, the pirate who chose to keep running rather than ever stop, and of exactly what that choice cost him, one exhausted, unguarded night at a time. Woodes Rogers himself is worth a moment's attention here, because he wasn't some anonymous colonial administrator handed a thankless posting. Rogers had made his own name years earlier as a privateer captain who circumnavigated the globe between 1708 and 1711, an expedition famous, among other things, for rescuing a marooned Scottish sailor named Alexander Selkirk from a remote Pacific island, the real castaway whose ordeal would later inspire Robinson Crusoe. A man who had already sailed around the world once, who understood exactly how thin the line was between a privateer working for the Crown and a pirate working for himself, arrived in Nassau in the summer of 1718, with both the pardon and a very clear-eyed understanding of the men he was there to either reform or remove. The squadron Rogers brought into that harbour was no token show of force either, and it's worth naming what Vane was actually watching sail toward him that summer morning. Rogers arrived with several Royal Navy vessels in company, escort enough to make plain that the Crown intended this pardon to be backed, for anyone inclined to refuse it, by genuine and immediate consequence. A floating demonstration of exactly the kind of overwhelming force this whole story has already described pirate crews spending months and years of broken sleep trying to stay ahead of. For most of the pirates crowded into Nassau that day, the calculation was simple: take the pardon offered freely, or face, eventually, a version of the fight that squadron was clearly equipped to win. Vane's decision to answer that calculation with a burning fireship rather than a signature is, in hindsight, the first domino in everything that followed. Nassau itself is worth understanding before Vane's specific choice makes full sense, because the settlement he refused to leave was, in its own way, built on exactly the same shallow water logic that has already run through this whole story. The town sat on a harbour too shallow for the Royal Navy's larger warships to enter safely, the same physics that let hunted crews hide in mangrove channels, working here at the scale of an entire settlement, a genuine semi-permanent pirate haven rather than a single ship's temporary hiding place, abandoned by formal English government years earlier after French and Spanish raids left it in ruins, and repopulated in the years after by exactly the kind of crews this story has spent all night describing. For those years, before Rogers arrived with his pardon and his squadron, Nassau offered pirates something almost nobody else in this story ever got to have: a fixed address, a place to careen without fear of ambush, a place to drink and gamble and sleep without a watch bell, a genuine settled community built entirely by and for men whose entire profession depended on never being settled anywhere else. Not every captain in that harbour made Vane's choice, and the contrast is worth naming directly. Benjamin Hornigold, one of the most respected and senior pirate captains operating out of Nassau at the time, a man who had, by several accounts, mentored a younger, then unremarkable sailor named Edward Teach before Teach ever grew the beard that would make him famous, accepted Rogers' pardon without hesitation, and went further still, agreeing to hunt down his former colleagues on the Crown's behalf in exchange for his own freedom. It's a genuinely strange, uncomfortable footnote, the same democratic, voted on culture that gave pirate crews more say over their own fate than almost any sailor of the era, also produced men willing to turn that same organisational skill against their former crews the moment the incentives shifted. Vane, watching men he'd sailed alongside for years take the pardon and, in some cases, turn hunter themselves, chose the opposite path. And whatever else can be said about the wisdom of that choice, it wasn't made in ignorance of the alternative sitting right in front of him. Vane's rise had been fast, even by the compressed standards of Golden Age piracy, a career built in a handful of years rather than a lifetime, the way so many careers in this story were. He'd sailed with the well-connected privateer turned pirate Henry Jennings in the years before Nassau became a formal target, cutting his teeth in the wreck salvaging and outright piracy that flourished around the Florida coast after a Spanish treasure fleet went down in a 1715 hurricane. By 1718, he commanded his own ship and crew, operating with a particular restless aggression that would come to define his reputation, a captain notorious even among pirates for a violent temper and a refusal to compromise, traits that would eventually cost him his own crew's loyalty as thoroughly as they cost him his freedom. Refusing the pardon meant refusing the one thing every other pirate captain in Nassau that summer was choosing: a settled place to sleep that didn't require a lookout, a bed that came with an actual dependable guarantee attached to it. Vane's decision to keep running instead put him on a different kind of clock entirely, one where every anchorage was temporary, every port potentially hostile, and every night's rest theoretically borrowed against a debt that would eventually come due. For the better part of the next year, Vane's ship moved almost constantly along the American coast and through the Bahamas, taking prizes where he found them, but increasingly finding fewer places willing to shelter a captain who'd made such a public, burning enemy of the Crown's new colonial governor. The turning point, the central conflict of Vane's story, the moment his reputation for aggression finally worked against him rather than for him, came not from a navy engagement at all, but from his own crew. The same body of men whose loyalty had once carried him to command. In November 1718, faced with the choice of fighting a well-armed French warship or fleeing, Vane chose to flee, a decision his quartermaster, a hard, capable pirate named Jack Rackham, publicly opposed, arguing the crew should fight for the prize instead. The crew, in the same democratic tradition that had put Vane in command in the first place, voted and voted him out, formally deposing him as captain and installing Rackham in his place, setting Vane and a small handful of loyal men adrift in a captured sloop with minimal provisions. It's a genuinely remarkable moment to sit with, a pirate crew using the exact same voting mechanism that gave a wounded man his compensation, that gave a tired crew its watch rotation to remove a captain whose judgment they no longer trusted. The system that offered pirates more say over their own fate than almost any sailor of the era cut both ways, and here it cut against the man who'd once benefited from it most. Multiple accounts describe roughly 15 men choosing to remain loyal to Vane and depart with him, a fraction of the crew he'd commanded only days before. Vane's temper, the trait multiple accounts single out as his defining flaw, is worth understanding a little further, because it shaped more than just the one mutiny that ended his command. Crews of this era tolerated a great deal from a captain who kept them fed, successful, and reasonably safe. The entire voted, articled structure of pirate governance existed precisely to check a captain's worst impulses without necessarily removing him the moment he showed them. Vane, by multiple accounts, tested that tolerance repeatedly in the months before the French warship incident, making unilateral decisions his own quartermaster and crew increasingly resented, treating disagreement as insubordination rather than the normal give-and-take a voted command structure was built to accommodate. The vote that finally removed him wasn't really about one ship and one French warship at all. It was the accumulated weight of a captain who had, slowly, stopped governing the way his own crew's articles assumed he would. Set adrift with a shrinking crew and a small, poorly provisioned sloop, Vane spent the following months in exactly the kind of precarious, opportunistic scramble that made rest genuinely dangerous. Taking what prizes he could find, unable to return to Nassau, unable to trust most ports, sleeping, by necessity, in the same defensive crouch he'd have used aboard ship, except now with fewer hands to share the watch and fewer resources if anything went wrong, and no larger crew left to absorb the cost of a single bad decision. Colonial correspondence from the months following Vane's deposal records at least one close call during this stretch. A Spanish Guarda Costa vessel, one of the armed Coast Guard sloops the Spanish Crown maintained specifically to interdict smugglers and pirates working the waters around their colonies, sighting and giving chase to a small sloop matching Vane's description off the Cuban coast. A pursuit Vane's diminished crew escaped only by running into water shallow enough to discourage further chase, the same shallow water logic every hunted crew in this story has leaned on, except now with a fraction of the hands needed to properly stand watch for the next threat. Every escape like this brought Vane another stretch of days, another cycle of exhausted, undermanned nights, and every one of them made the eventual reckoning slightly more inevitable simply by wearing down the small crew that remained loyal to him. It went wrong for good in February 1719, off the Bay Islands near Honduras, when a hurricane caught his ship and drove it onto the rocks, wrecking it entirely and marooning Vane and his surviving crew on a small, largely uninhabited island with almost nothing. The weeks that followed strip away every last piece of structure this whole story has described protecting a hunted crew's rest. No watch rotation because there was no ship to stand watch over, no articles left to enforce because there was no longer a common stock of plunder to divide, no shallow anchorage to hide in because the island itself was the only shelter available. Survivors on marooned, resource-poor islands throughout this era generally subsisted on whatever could be fished, trapped, or foraged, sleeping in the open or under whatever crude shelter could be built from driftwood and salvaged canvas, with real, constant risk of starvation compounding every other danger. It's a version of exhaustion this story hasn't shown yet, not too little sleep because of constant interruption, but a slow, grinding uncertainty about whether there would be any way off the island at all. What happened next is one of the more genuinely eerie ironies in the entire Golden Age of Piracy. Vane spent weeks marooned, sleeping rough on open ground with no ship, no crew beyond a handful of survivors, and no way off the island, until eventually a passing vessel anchored nearby to take on water, and Vane, in a decision that would prove fatal, convinced its crew to take him aboard, concealing his identity as best he could. The ship's captain, a man named Holford, happened to be an old acquaintance of Vane's from his earlier privateering days, and recognised him almost immediately despite the disguise. Holford, by most accounts, refused to let a known pirate captain remain aboard his vessel, and rather than sailing away and simply leaving Vane on the island, arranged for him to be handed over to authorities instead, the very network of coastal recognition and reputation that pirates like Vane relied on to move safely between ports, working, in this single instance, entirely against him. Vane's trial at Jamaica drew on testimony from captured merchant sailors and colonial officials who had crossed paths with him during his final restless year on the run, painting a picture consistent enough with the reputation that had followed him since Nassau, that the outcome was, by most accounts, never seriously in doubt. Unlike the forced men who'd stood trial after Robert's capture, arguing they'd been compelled aboard against their will, Vane had commanded his own ship by his own choice for years, refused a lawful pardon explicitly offered to him, and continued taking prizes well after that refusal, a record that left him with essentially no version of the forced man defence available to plead. Vane was transported to Jamaica, tried for piracy in March 1721, convicted, and hanged at Gallows Point in Port Royal, a location chosen deliberately for its visibility to ships entering the harbour, so that the execution itself would serve as a warning to exactly the kind of restless, unpardoned pirate captain Vane had spent his final years trying to remain. His body was afterward gibbeted, displayed in an iron cage at a small nearby quay, later known as Gun Cay, left exposed as a long-term deterrent to any sailor who might be tempted to follow his path. Vane's wasn't the first such display, and it wouldn't be the last. The Crown had used the same tactic against the pirate William Kidd nearly 2 decades earlier, gibbeting his body along the Thames at Tilbury in 1701 as a warning to every sailor departing London for the open sea. It's a brutal, deliberately public final image, and it's worth naming plainly what it was for. Not justice in any private sense, but surveillance made permanent. A corpse left where every passing ship could see exactly what refusing the pardon and choosing to keep running had ultimately bought. Jack Rackham, the quartermaster whose vote unseated Vane over that argument about fighting the French warship, didn't escape this story's ending either, and his own fate is worth a brief mention here, since it closes a loop this chapter opened. Rackham commanded his own crew for roughly a year after taking Vane's place, eventually accepting a pardon of his own before returning, like Teachwood after his own brief settled stretch in Bath, to the only trade he apparently knew how to sleep well practicing. He was captured in October 1720 off Jamaica, his crew including 2 of the era's most famous female pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, both of whom fought, by multiple accounts, more fiercely during the capture than most of the men aboard. Rackham was hanged in November 1720, a few short months before Vane would follow him to the same colony's gallows, 2 captains, once sailing the same deck, undone within half a year of each other by the same relentless arithmetic this whole chapter has been tracing. There's a version of Vane's story that reads as simple stubbornness punished. The pirate who wouldn't take the easy exit, undone by his own temper and pride. That's not entirely wrong. It's worth remembering, too, that Vane wasn't operating in a vacuum of pure choice. Every port he might once have trusted grew more hostile with each month that passed after Roger's arrival. Colonial governors up and down the coast increasingly coordinated in their willingness to prosecute, rather than quietly tolerate a pirate captain passing through. The world that had once made Nassau possible was closing, port by port, around every captain who hadn't taken the pardon while it was still on offer, which doesn't make Vane's choice wiser in hindsight, but does make it slightly less purely a matter of one man's stubborn temperament than the popular telling sometimes allows. But underneath it, it is something closer to the actual cost of the choice this whole chapter has been circling. What it meant, specifically, to refuse a settled place to sleep, to keep running instead, for month after month, until exhaustion, bad weather, and one recognised face finally closed the distance that cannon fire never quite managed to. Vane outran the Royal Navy directly for most of his final year. What caught him, in the end, was almost everything except the thing he'd spent that year preparing to outrun. News of the execution didn't need official channels to spread through the scattered remnants of the pirate world Vane had once belonged to. It moved the same way every other piece of consequential information in this story has moved, hand to hand, ship to ship, through the same loose network of wreckers, traders, and sympathetic captains who'd once carried word of Navy sightings to crews hiding in mangrove anchorages. By the time the story reached the more distant corners of the Caribbean, months after the actual hanging, the details had inevitably drifted the way rumour always drifted aboard a hunted ship, the gibbet grown taller in some retellings, the body left hanging longer in others, but the core of it arrived intact everywhere it went. Refuse the pardon, keep running, and this is what waits at the end of the running. It's the same eyewitness relay texture this whole story keeps returning to, repurposed here not to warn of an approaching threat, but to broadcast the consequence of one particular way of trying to survive it. His story became, deliberately and immediately, a lesson broadcast to every pirate crew still weighing the pardon Rogers had offered, proof, gibbeted and visible from the water, of exactly what the alternative to rest, to safety, to a settled anchorage, ultimately looked like. Not every captain who heard that lesson chose to learn from it. One of the most famous ones didn't, and his own final night would prove, in an entirely different way, just how dangerous it was to finally let your guard down. That danger didn't always come from the sea, or from a chase that had run too long. Sometimes it waited below decks, in the mattress itself, in the crowded, breathing dark where an entire crew tried to rest within arm's reach of each other, night after night, for months. The hammock you're lying in tonight has travelled further, historically speaking, than most of the ships that carry it, further even than most of the men sleeping in it tonight have ever personally travelled themselves. Before it was a fixture of naval life, it was hammocker, a word and a technology belonging to the Tano people of the Caribbean, who slung woven cotton netting between trees to sleep clear of the ground, away from insects, snakes and flooding, a genuinely elegant piece of engineering that Christopher Columbus's sailors encountered on first contact, and, with the pragmatic theft common to that entire era of European contact with the Americas, promptly adopted for their own ships. By the time you're lying in one, more than 2 centuries later, the hammock has been formally adopted into naval regulation, and the specific version swaying gently around you tonight, and around every other man sleeping below decks, is a small, brilliant piece of design that almost nobody stops to appreciate, while resenting it. Here's the mundane comfort first, before the subversion arrives, because there genuinely is comfort here, and it's worth giving it its due before the rest of this chapter takes it away again. A hammock, unlike a fixed bunk, moves with the ship's roll instead of against it, meaning a man sleeping in one is far less likely to be pitched bodily onto the deck during rough seas. A real, meaningfully practical improvement over the wooden platform, bunks common on older or more old-fashioned vessels. It packs away small, takes up almost no space during the day when the gun deck needs to be clear for fighting, and, worn correctly, it's genuinely comfortable in a way that surprises people who've never tried one. The subversion is the arithmetic of exactly how many of these things are hanging in the space you're trying to sleep in, and it's worse than it sounds. Royal Navy regulation, once it was formalised, specified hammocks be slung roughly 14 inches apart, gunwale to gunwale down the length of the gun deck, a spacing so tight that a man of average build sleeping in one is separated from the next man's shoulder by roughly the width of a dinner plate. Pirate crews, running with fewer official constraints but often with just as many bodies packed into a similarly sized hull, frequently crowded below decks in conditions that matched or exceeded that density, especially on a ship that had recently taken on a batch of forced men or new volunteers from a captured vessel. Multiply 14 inches by 60, 80, sometimes over 100 men on a larger pirate vessel, and you get a gun deck that at night looks less like a bedroom and more like a butcher's row of canvas cocoons, swaying in a loose, unsynchronized rhythm as the ship rolls beneath them. The escalation, and there's always an escalation, is everything living in that space alongside you, crowding in alongside the men themselves. Night after night, uninvited, rats were a near universal feature of wooden sailing ships of this era, drawn by ship's stores of grain, biscuit and salted meat, and multiple period accounts describe infestations bad enough that sailors reported waking to find rats had gnawed at exposed skin, fingers and toes, in their sleep not a constant occurrence, but common enough to be a documented. Recognised hazard rather than an exaggeration. Add to that the near-universal presence of lice and fleas in the close unwashed conditions below decks. The cockroaches that thrived in the ship's stores and worked their way into every crevice of the hull, and the simple, unavoidable fact that 60 to 100 unwashed bodies sharing an unventilated space below the waterline generates a smell strong enough that period accounts frequently. Mention new hands needing days to adjust to it. Here's the thing, you do adjust. The human capacity to normalise a smell, a sound, a level of crowding that would seem unbearable described from the outside, is one of the genuinely remarkable, if slightly grim, features of how quickly people adapt to whatever environment keeps them alive. Air itself becomes a resource down here, rationed by geography as much as anything else aboard. The gun deck draws whatever fresh air it gets through open gun ports, when weather allows them to stay open, and through the main hatches, which means the men sleeping nearest those openings catch what breeze there is, while everyone else makes do with what's left by the time it reaches them. In the tropics, that arrangement turns the space into something close to an oven by midnight. Heat radiating up from bodies packed 14 inches apart, with nowhere for it to go. Sail into colder latitudes chasing a prize or fleeing a patrol, and the same sealed, poorly ventilated space becomes the opposite problem entirely. Gunports battened shut against spray and cold. The same crowded air now trapping damp and chill instead of heat. Men sleeping in whatever extra clothing they own layered over the discomfort of canvas that never quite dries. There's no version of this sleeping arrangement that's comfortable in every climate. There's only the version you learn to tolerate in whichever climate you happen to be running through this month. The hammocks themselves don't just disappear during the day, they serve a second, entirely practical purpose that most men sleeping in them never think about until the one morning it matters. Once stowed, rolled tight and lashed each morning in a specific practiced sequence everyone aboard learns within their first weeks, hammocks were commonly stored along the ship's rails in netting built specifically to hold them, a piece of design so useful it became standard naval practice. A wall of tightly rolled canvas and bedding, dense enough to actually help absorb and deflect musket balls and splinters during close engagement, turning the crew's bedding into a modest extra layer of protection exactly when they needed it most. It's a small, almost elegant piece of dual-purpose design. The thing you sleep in by night becomes, by day, part of what might keep you alive in a fight. And it's the kind of detail that tends to get lost entirely in the swashbuckling version of this story, where nobody stops to ask where all those hammocks actually went once the cannon started. The noise below decks deserves its own honest accounting too, because sleep here was never quiet, and expecting it to be was a lesson every new hand learned within their first few nights whether they wanted to or not. 60 to 100 men breathing, snoring, coughing, shifting in canvas that creaks with every movement, someone muttering through a nightmare 2 hammocks down, someone else grinding their teeth, the whole space rising and falling with a kind of ragged, overlapping rhythm that never fully settles into silence even in the deepest hours of the night. Privacy, in any sense a modern listener would recognize it, simply didn't exist down here. Not for grief, not for pain, not for the small, human indignities of illness or fear that a man might otherwise want to keep to himself. You learn out of necessity a specific kind of collective discretion, hearing everything and acknowledging almost none of it directly. The unspoken agreement of men who have no choice but to share this much of each other's nights, and choose deliberately not to comment on most of what they hear. Even the smallest personal rituals took on outsized importance in a space this crowded and this exposed. Men kept whatever grooming routine they could manage, a straight razor passed carefully around, hair cropped short by a crewmate willing to do the job, nails trimmed with whatever blade was handy, not out of vanity so much as a stubborn. Quiet insistence on retaining some small piece of ordinary self-care in a life that offered almost nothing else resembling normalcy. It's easy to overlook entirely, buried under everything louder and grimmer this chapter has already described, but it mattered in its own understated way, proof that even here, even packed 14 inches apart in the crowded dark, men found small ways to keep hold of themselves. Disease moved through that crowded dark the way rumour moved through the ship above it, quietly, then all at once. Dysentery, referred to by sailors of the era simply as the bloody flux, spread easily in conditions where clean water was scarce and close quarters made isolating the sick nearly impossible, and typhus, carried by the same lice infesting the hammocks and clothing of a crowded gun deck, could move through a ship's company with frightening speed once it took hold. Sailors of the period sometimes calling it ship fever for exactly that reason. A man too sick to stand watch was a man someone else had to cover for, which meant illness below decks didn't just threaten the man suffering from it. It thinned the watch rotation for everyone else, turning a personal misfortune into a collective one within days. Crews developed their own rough, imperfect countermeasures, separating the obviously sick where space allowed, boiling what water could be spared, picking lice from seams and hair in the idle hours between watches. A small, communal ritual that shows up across period accounts as something closer to habit than hygiene theory, since nobody aboard understood the actual mechanism of contagion. It worked, when it worked, more by accident than design, but it worked often enough to matter. What almost gets lost in all of that is the one genuinely striking egalitarian detail buried inside the misery. On many pirate ships, unlike their naval counterparts, the captain often slept in conditions not dramatically better than his crews. Naval captains of this era were entitled by rank to private, often comfortable cabins. A wide gulf of comfort separating officer from common sailor that mirrored the wider social hierarchy of the era. Pirate captains, elected by their crews and removable by the same vote that put them in power, as Charles Vane learned the hard way, generally couldn't claim that same automatic privilege. Some captains did retain a small private cabin as a practical necessity, for navigation charts and ship's business rather than personal luxury, but the sharp, rank-based gulf in comfort that defined naval life was, on many pirate ships, meaningfully flattened. It's a small, structural kind of dignity, easy to miss, and it's worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. The same vote that could depose a captain also meant, in a very literal sense, that he was sleeping in roughly the same crowded dark as everyone else who'd voted him into the job. The one piece of genuine privacy most men aboard could claim was smaller than the hammock itself, a sea chest, wedged wherever space allowed, holding whatever few personal possessions a man had managed to accumulate or keep, a spare shirt, a knife, sometimes a small keepsake carried from whatever life he'd had before signing the articles. It wasn't much. On a ship where almost nothing else belonged exclusively to any one man. It was, functionally, everything. You learn quickly which chests belonged to which hammocks without ever being told. The same unspoken cartography that governs every crowded space people are forced to share for long enough. Fresh water was rationed carefully enough aboard most ships of this era that bathing, in any regular sense, simply wasn't part of shipboard life. What water there was went to drinking and cooking first, with washing treated as a luxury to be indulged only when a rain squall or a friendly stream ashore made it briefly free. That absence of regular washing compounds everything else already crowded into this space. The lice, the shared clothing worn for weeks at a stretch, the general low-grade discomfort of skin that never quite gets properly clean. A rain squall, when one caught the ship at the right moment, became genuine cause for something like celebration. Men stripping down on deck to catch what fresh water they could directly from the sky. A small, undignified, entirely welcome break from a routine that offered vanishingly few of them. The youngest hand aboard, a boy of perhaps 12 named Toby Rennick, who came to piracy the way a fair number of ship's boys did. Orphaned young, taken on by a merchant captain as cheap labour, then simply transferred along with the rest of the crew when that merchant vessel was captured and its people given the same choice Cass once faced, sleeps closest to the ship's magazine, where the gunpowder is stored, because his job in any engagement is to run cartridges up from that magazine to the gun crews above as fast as his legs will carry him. It's one of the more quietly brutal arrangements of shipboard life. The smallest, youngest body aboard positioned nearest the single most dangerous cargo the ship carries, expected to move through smoke and noise and chaos faster than grown men twice his size. Toby sleeps with his boots on more often than not, the same way you learned to weeks ago, and he's picked up Cass's habit of keeping his small allotment of possessions, a whittled toy soldier, a spare bit of twine, wrapped tight and tucked against his body, rather than left loose in a sea chest. The particular, unspoken vigilance of a boy who has already learned, young, exactly how quickly a life at sea can take away whatever little a person manages to keep. The crowding this whole chapter has already described gets briefly dramatically worse in the days right after a successful capture, before the fleet has had time to sort itself out. A newly taken prize crew, volunteers and forced men alike, temporarily doubles or even triples the number of bodies needing somewhere to sling a hammock, and for those first chaotic days before some are transferred to a second ship or a captain decides who stays and who's put ashore, the gun deck becomes considerably more crowded than even its normal uncomfortable baseline. Men sleep in shifts more strictly than usual simply because there isn't room for everyone to lie down at once, watch and rest overlapping in a tighter, more exhausting rotation than the ship's usual rhythm allows. It sorts itself out within a week or two, one way or another, but the 14 inches of canvas separating you from the next man's shoulder has a way of feeling considerably narrower in the immediate aftermath of good fortune than it does on an ordinary night. One more small, unglamorous cost tucked inside every successful raid. Every so often, a captured prize hands the whole crew a brief, strange upgrade to all of this, and it's worth including if only for the contrast. A merchant vessel taken with its cargo intact might yield, alongside coin and trade goods, genuinely fine linens, real mattresses, sometimes a captain's private stock of good bedding, never intended for common sailors at all. And for a stretch of days or weeks after a rich enough prize, some portion of the crew sleeps considerably better than usual, on goods looted from exactly the kind of comfortable, settled life piracy had taken most of these men away from in the first place. It never lasts. Fine linen doesn't hold up to salt air and constant use any better than anything else aboard, and what isn't divided up as plunder or sold at the next friendly port simply wears through within a season, same as everything else. But for those few weeks the gun deck smells faintly of someone else's good soap instead of bilge water, and nobody aboard pretends not to notice the difference. Cass Okafor, 3 berths down from you in this particular arrangement of swaying canvas, keeps his hammock unusually, almost fastidiously neat by shipboard standards, folded and lashed a specific way each morning, a habit he attributes, when asked once, to years of training as a much younger man aboard the very different kind of ship that first brought him across the Atlantic, where order was one of vanishingly few things a man in his position had any control over at all. It's a small detail, the kind easy to miss in the general noise and crowding of the gun deck, but it tells you something true about him, that some habits once forged under conditions far worse than this don't get shed just because the circumstances technically improved. By your 4th month aboard, you've developed your own version of that same small protective ritual, a specific way of coiling a spare line to use as extra padding under your shoulder, learned from watching an older hand do the same thing without ever being told why, until your own aching shoulder explained it for you. Sleep here is never going to be silent, it's never going to be private, and it's never going to be free of the small, constant, crowded discomforts of 60 other men breathing, snoring, shifting, and occasionally cursing in the dark around you. But somewhere in the 4th month, something shifts, and the crowded dark stops registering as a hardship and starts registering, almost without your noticing the change, as simply where you sleep, proof, in its own small and unglamorous way, that people can adapt to almost anything, given enough nights to practice. There's one warm, genuinely companionable spot below decks worth naming before this chapter closes, because it cuts against the general grimness of everything else crowded into this space. The galley fire, the ship's single source of cooked food and, in cold weather, one of very few sources of actual warmth aboard. Cooking fires at sea were treated with enormous caution for the obvious reason. An uncontrolled blaze aboard a wooden ship loaded with gunpowder was a threat easily as dangerous as any Navy frigate. But within that caution, the galley still functioned as something close to a gathering point, men drifting near it in their off hours less for the food itself than for the simple, animal comfort of proximity to heat and the smell of something other than tar and bilge water. It's a small, easy thing to overlook in a story built mostly around danger and exhaustion, but it mattered. A crew that ate together, even briefly, even standing rather than seated, held on to a small thread of ordinary human routine in a life that offered vanishingly few of them. What happens on the nights the hammocks empty out fast, when the alarm bell means something real instead of a whale or a moonlit palm frond, is where this whole crowded, uncomfortable, oddly democratic sleeping arrangement gets tested for real. Every man's practiced, half-asleep scramble suddenly mattering in a way it never does on an ordinary night. That's coming. For tonight, the gun deck sways gently, 60 cocoons of canvas rocking in loose unison, and somewhere in the dark, Cass Okafor's careful lashed hammock holds its shape exactly the way he left it. Not every hunted crew got the luxury of being caught unaware, or of preparing at all. Sometimes the danger arrived precisely when a captain's guard, and his crews, was down for reasons that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with a party that ran too late. It's the night of November 21st, 1718, and there is, by the account of a captured pirate later deposed at trial, a boat rowing between Edward Teach's sloop Adventure and a nearby merchant vessel he'd recently boarded, carrying men back and forth for what several accounts describe as a night of drinking and socializing between the two crews, anchored together in the shallows near Ocracoke Inlet on the coast of North Carolina. Somewhere out past the inlet, 2 small sloops carrying a detachment of Royal Navy sailors under the command of a young lieutenant named Robert Maynard, are working their way in against the tide, running dark, timing their approach specifically for the following dawn. Teach, the man history would remember as Blackbeard, and whose actual biography is buried under more legend, invention, and outright fabrication than almost any other pirate of the era, will be dead within 24 hours, in a fight so violent and so close quarters that it has become, deservedly or not, one of the most retold engagements of the entire Golden Age. This is the story of Blackbeard's last anchorage, and of exactly how a man who'd spent years cultivating a reputation for terrifying calculated menace ended up caught, by most accounts, with his guard genuinely down. The menace itself is worth understanding first, because it explains why Teach so rarely had to fight at all in the years before that final morning, and why an unguarded night was such an uncharacteristic risk for him to take. Multiple contemporary accounts describe Teach deliberately cultivating a terrifying appearance before engagements, the thick black beard the name comes from. Worn long and sometimes tied with ribbons, and, according to several sources close enough to the period to carry real weight, slow-burning fuses tucked under his hat brim and lit before a fight, so that smoke curled up around his face in the moment his targets first saw him. It was, functionally, a kind of psychological weapon, and by most accounts a highly effective one. A merchant crew that surrendered the moment they recognised Teach's ship rarely had to be fought at all, which meant fewer casualties on both sides and less wear on Teach's own crew and vessel. Terror, in other words, was doing a meaningful share of the work that cannon fire would otherwise have had to do, which makes the eventual outcome at Ocracoke, where the reputation failed to prevent a fight entirely, all the more striking. Teach's career by that point had already taken one very deliberate, very strange turn worth understanding before the final battle makes sense. Earlier that same year, commanding a much larger flagship called Queen Anne's Revenge, along with a substantial flotilla and crew numbering in the hundreds, Teach had run the ship aground, deliberately according to most historians who've examined the incident, at Topsail Inlet, near modern Beaufort, North Carolina, in June 1718. The most widely accepted explanation is calculated rather than accidental, with too large a crew to divide plunder profitably among, and having recently accepted a royal pardon under the same King's Act of Grace that Charles Vane refused, Teach appears to have used the wreck as a pretext to strand and abandon a large portion of his own crew, keeping the most loyal. Smallest core group, and a disproportionate share of the accumulated loot for himself. It's a genuinely cold, calculating move for a man whose public reputation rested almost entirely on theatrical menace, rather than quiet betrayal, and it left him, by the time of his final anchorage 5 months later, commanding a much smaller operation than the one that had made him famous. Only weeks before that deliberate wreck, Teach had staged one of the boldest displays of his entire career, and it's worth including here because it shows the same theatrical menace working at a civic scale rather than a ship-to-ship one. In late May 1718, Teach blockaded the harbour of Charleston, South Carolina, with his flotilla, stopping incoming and outgoing vessels and taking hostages from among the town's prominent citizens, holding them until the colony's governor agreed to send a chest of medicine ashore to the pirates in exchange for their release. For nearly a week, an entire port city lived with a version of the exact dread this whole story has been describing from the pirates' side. Residents going to bed uncertain whether the morning would bring another hostage taken, another ship stopped, another demand, an entire town's sleep held hostage by a handful of ships anchored just outside the bar. Teach got his medicine chest and released his hostages unharmed, and the episode did more to cement his fearsome reputation up and down the coast than almost anything else in his career. Which makes it all the stranger, in hindsight, that the man capable of holding a city hostage through sheer reputation alone would be caught 6 months later with his own guard down. There's a brief, almost domestic chapter in Teach's final year worth including, because it makes the ending land differently once you know it happened. After accepting the pardon and running his flagship aground earlier that summer, Teach spent a stretch of weeks settled at Bath, the small colonial capital of North Carolina, living for a time among its residents with what colonial records suggest was at least a degree of genuine social acceptance. Governor Eden himself reportedly on cordial enough terms with him to raise real suspicion afterward about how much protection Teach had been quietly promised in exchange. It didn't last. Whether from restlessness, from the pull of a trade he'd never actually abandoned in practice even after accepting its formal pardon, or simply from the arithmetic of plunder running out, Teach was back on the water within a matter of weeks, trading the closest thing to a settled bed he'd have in his final year for the same restless, anchorage-to-anchorage existence that would end, a few months later, at Ocracoke. It's worth sitting with for a moment, even a man as famous for menace as Blackbeard tried, briefly, to choose the version of rest Cass Okafor would later find for himself, and, unlike Cass, couldn't make it hold. That smaller scale is central to understanding what happened at Ocracoke. By November, Teach's crew numbered perhaps 20 men, a fraction of his peak strength, operating a single sloop rather than a flotilla, in waters he'd come to treat as something close to a safe harbour, not through the shallow draft tactical logic of hiding from Navy frigates that we've already covered, though that logic certainly applied here too. but through something closer to complacency, built on months of relatively undisturbed operation along a coastline where local officials, by multiple contemporary accounts, had grown either unwilling or unable to move against him. Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia, frustrated that Teach operated largely outside his own colony's direct jurisdiction, and suspicious that North Carolina's own governor, Charles Eden, was, at minimum, turning a convenient blind eye in exchange for a cut of the pirates' plunder, financed and organised the naval expedition against him privately, outside official Royal Navy channels, which is itself a small telling detail about how thin institutional pursuit of pirates could actually be, even at the height of concern about piracy along the American coast. Ocracoke Inlet itself is worth picturing clearly, because the geography did as much to shape that final battle as any decision either commander made, a shifting shallow passage separating a low-barrier island from the open Atlantic, its channels rearranged constantly by storm and tide in ways that made it treacherous for any vessel without intimate local knowledge. It was exactly the kind of shallow draft haven this whole story has already spent hours explaining, a place larger Navy vessels simply could not follow a shallow sloop into, which is precisely why Teach had come to treat it as reliably safe. The irony, sharp enough that it's worth naming directly, is that Maynard's own small sloops were shallow enough to work the same waters, meaning the one piece of geography that had protected Teach for months offered him no advantage at all against a pursuer willing to match his draft rather than overpower him with size. It's also worth remembering, briefly, that Teach hadn't come to this trade from nowhere. Several accounts place him, in his earlier years at sea, serving under Benjamin Hornigold, the same senior Nassau captain whose later choice to accept Woodes Rogers's pardon and turn pirate hunter stood in such stark contrast to Charles Vane's decision to keep running. Teach learned a meaningful part of his trade under a man who would go on to hunt former colleagues for the crown, and chose when his own moment came neither Hornigold's accommodation nor quite Vane's endless flight, but something closer to a third path, a deliberate downsizing, a calculated betrayal of his own larger crew, and a retreat into a smaller, quieter operation he believed, wrongly, as it turned out, had made him safe enough to finally let his guard down. At his peak, several months before the deliberate wrecking at Topsail Inlet, Teach had commanded a genuinely formidable force. Queen Anne's Revenge alone reportedly mounted 40 guns, sailing in company with 3 or 4 smaller vessels and a combined crew numbering, by some contemporary estimates, close to 400 men. A force large enough that few merchant captains anywhere along the American coast would have seriously considered resisting it. That scale is worth holding next to the 20 men who stood with him at Ocracoke 5 months later, because the contrast tells you almost everything about the arc this chapter has been tracing. A captain who built an operation large enough to blockade an entire city, then deliberately dismantled most of it himself, only to be caught, in the end, commanding a force smaller than the crew of a single well-manned merchant sloop. What happened to Teach's remains afterward has its own stubborn, thinly documented afterlife in local legend, and it's worth including with the same caution owed to every other unverifiable detail in this story. Local Tidewater, Virginia tradition, recorded well after the fact and impossible to confirm against any contemporary source, holds that Teach's skull was eventually fashioned into a drinking vessel displayed for a time at a tavern near Hampton. Whether any part of that story is true is genuinely unknowable at this distance. It belongs squarely in the same category as Robert's muddy water quotation and the buried treasure that colonial searchers never actually found, a piece of folklore that tells you more about how badly the era wanted its most notorious pirate to have a suitably gruesome ending than about anything that verifiably happened to his body. The eyewitness texture of that final night comes to us, again, primarily through trial depositions given by captured crew members afterward. Men testifying again with obvious motive to shape the story favourably for themselves, which means the specific details should be held with appropriate caution even as the broad shape is well attested. What multiple accounts agree on is that the socialising between Teach's crew and the merchant vessel he'd recently stopped ran late into the night, that drink flowed freely, and that when Maynard's 2 sloops were finally sighted approaching at first light on the morning of the 22nd, Teach's ship was caught with fewer hands ready for battle than the situation demanded. And with the element of surprise so central to Teach's own carefully cultivated reputation for intimidation, working, for once, entirely against him instead of for him. The battle itself, when it came, was close, brutal, and almost shockingly hand-to-hand for an engagement so central to pirate legend. Maynard's approach ran his own sloop briefly aground in the shallow inlet waters, and Teach, seeing the Navy vessel apparently disabled, closed for what he likely believed would be an easy boarding action, only to discover that Maynard had deliberately kept the bulk of his own crew concealed below decks, springing them onto the deck at the last possible moment once Teach's men had already committed to boarding. What followed was reportedly a savage, close-quarters melee lasting mere minutes, ending with Teach himself, according to the ship's surgeon who examined the body afterward, and whose account is among the more carefully documented details of the whole engagement, having suffered some 20 sword wounds and 5 gunshot wounds before finally falling. Maynard had Teach's severed head mounted on the bowsprit of his sloop for the return voyage, a piece of grim, deliberate theatre meant to prove the kill, and not incidentally, to serve as exactly the same kind of visible warning that would later hang Charles Vane's body from a cage above Gun K. There's a small, almost bitterly funny coda to Maynard's own story worth including, because it undercuts any tidy sense that the Navy side of this hunt got a cleaner reward than the pirates did. Maynard returned from the engagement expecting the substantial bounty Spotswood had promised for Teach's death, only to find himself tangled for years afterward in disputes over pay and prize money with colonial authorities, more interested in claiming credit for the victory than compensating the men who'd actually fought it. A reminder that even on the winning side of this whole exhausting, sleepless hunt, rest and reward were very often just as hard to actually collect as they were for the men being hunted. Spotswood's own victory came with political costs that rarely make it into the popular telling of this story either. Because the expedition he'd financed and dispatched had operated entirely outside his own colony's borders, striking at a target anchored in North Carolina waters rather than Virginia's, questions were raised, some by North Carolina's own governor, Charles Eden, whose administration Spotswood had all but publicly accused of protecting Teach in exchange for a cut of his plunder, about whether Spotswood had any legal authority to have mounted the raid at all. The dispute dragged on in correspondence back to London for months afterward, a reminder that even a decisive military victory against one of the era's most notorious pirates didn't automatically translate into a settled, sleep-easy outcome for the man who'd ordered it. Spotswood, like almost everyone else running through this story, found that winning didn't necessarily mean resting easy afterward. A number of Teach's surviving crew, taken alive during the fighting or captured shortly after, were transported to Williamsburg, Virginia, and tried there in the weeks following the battle. Several were hanged, at least a few managed to demonstrate, through testimony echoing the same forced versus volunteer distinction that would later decide the fate of so many of Robert's men at Cape Coast Castle, that they'd had no meaningful choice in joining Teach's crew, and were released. It's the same grim sorting process this story keeps returning to, in port after port, colony after colony, a hunted life ending not in one clean moment, but in a courtroom, with a man's fate turning on how convincingly he could prove that his own presence aboard had never really been a choice at all. Here's what almost never makes it into the popular retelling, and it's the detail that connects this whole bloody engagement back to the theme of this entire hunted. Sleepless life, Teach was caught not primarily because Maynard outfought him, though he did, but because Teach's crew, and by most accounts Teach himself, had let their guard down on exactly the kind of ordinary, human occasion, a shared night of drink and company between two crews, that the entire hunted existence of a pirate ship theoretically couldn't afford. Every lesson from earlier in this voyage, the watch rotations, the shallow anchorages, chosen specifically because larger ships couldn't follow, the lights-out clauses written into pirate articles precisely to protect a crew's ability to actually rest and stay sharp. All of it depended on discipline that, on this one specific night, appears to have slipped. It's not a morality tale exactly. Teach had operated successfully and violently for years by that point, and a great deal of what happened at Ocracoke came down to Maynard's genuinely clever tactical deception rather than simple negligence. But the anchorage where you finally let yourself feel safe enough to relax is, historically speaking, exactly the anchorage where the Royal Navy's most successful hunts tended to land. In the weeks after Teach's death, Spotswood's men searched the Adventure and the surrounding waters at Ocracoke for the vast hoard popular imagination had already begun attaching to his name, and found, by most accounts, comparatively modest amounts of plunder aboard, nothing remotely close to the buried fortune generations of treasure hunters would later spend small fortunes of their own. Searching Carolina beaches for. It's a small, almost anticlimactic detail, easy to skip past, but it's worth sitting with directly. The legend of hidden treasure attached itself to Teach's name almost immediately after his death, and has outlived every documented search that ever failed to actually find it. The scene on deck once the fighting stopped was, by every surviving account, a brutal one to witness even for men accustomed to violence. A small, close space littered with the dead and wounded of both crews, the water around the grounded sloops churned red in the shallows. Maynard reportedly found Teach's body still gripping a weapon, a detail multiple depositions agree on even amid their other disagreements, the kind of small, consistent physical detail that tends to survive even when the surrounding narrative gets reshaped in the retelling. It's a stark, unglamorous image to end a man's story on, and it's worth letting it sit there plainly rather than rushing past it toward the legend that would immediately begin growing over it. Teach's legend, of course, outgrew every documented fact within a single generation, inflated by Johnson's history and by 2 centuries of popular retelling into something closer to myth than biography. The buried treasure that almost certainly never existed in the form legend describes. The supernatural flourishes, the invented dialogue attributed to a man who left behind almost no verified words of his own. What's left, once you strip away the legend and hold on to only what the depositions, the surgeon's report and the colonial correspondence actually support, is a genuinely human story. A captain who'd already once betrayed and abandoned much of his own crew for profit, operating with a much smaller and more exposed force than his reputation implied, caught on an ordinary night of drink and company by a young lieutenant patient, and clever enough to disguise his own vulnerability the exact same way Teach had spent years disguising his own true intentions behind theatrical menace. What remains, after the head comes down off the bowsprit and the body is thrown overboard, is the same lesson Robert's crew would learn, less dramatically. 4 years later off Cape Lopez, the sea and its hunters don't forgive a relaxed watch, no matter how fearsome the reputation guarding it. That lesson didn't end anyone's need to actually sleep, though. It just made every crew that heard it a little more careful about exactly when and where and how deeply they let themselves do it. Learning that lesson and actually living inside it, night after night, for months or years at a stretch, without breaking under the weight of it, turned out to require its own quiet body of skills, smaller, less dramatic than any single battle, and in their own way just as hard won. You wake for the 3rd time tonight, or perhaps the 4th, to a sound that turns out to be nothing, a loose block swinging against the mast in a freshening wind, not a hailed challenge, not a cannon's report, nothing at all, and you lie there in the dark for a long moment afterward, heart still going faster than the noise deserved, listening past your own pulse for whatever might come next, before finally letting yourself settle back into the hammock. This is the part of the hunted life almost nobody accounts for honestly. Not the battles, which are rare, but the 1,000 small false alarms in between them, each one costing you a slice of the deep restorative sleep your body actually needs, until you've spent a season learning, out of sheer necessity, how to sleep anyway, night after imperfect night. Not deeply. Not without interruption. But anyway. The diet you're living on doesn't help matters, and it's worth being honest about exactly what was fueling a body expected to fight, climb, and stand watch on broken rest, night after night, for months at a stretch. Salted meat dried well past the point of appetizing, and ship's biscuit, a hard, twice-baked bread meant to survive months at sea without spoiling, and notorious enough for developing weevil infestations that sailors of the period had a standard grim ritual of tapping the biscuit on the table before eating to knock loose whatever had taken up residence inside it. It's not the kind of diet that supports genuinely restorative sleep, heavy in salt and short on the fresh food that might have eased the low-grade exhaustion everyone aboard was already carrying. And scurvy, caused by prolonged vitamin C deficiency and a serious, sometimes fatal risk on long voyages of this era, added its own layer of fatigue and physical misery to men already running on borrowed rest. Fresh food, when a raid or a friendly port provided it, was treated with something close to reverence for exactly this reason. One small four-legged member of the crew deserves a mention here too, because he does more for everyone's sleep than almost anyone aboard fully appreciates. Ships of this era commonly carried a cat, kept specifically to hunt the rats that would otherwise overrun the hold and the crowded gun deck alike, and the practice was common enough across naval and merchant vessels that a good ratting cat was considered a genuinely valuable piece of a ship's company, rather than a mere pet. This ship's cat, an unglamorous grey Tom the crew calls, without much originality, Bosun, sleeps wherever he pleases and answers to no watch schedule at all, the one creature aboard entirely exempt from every system of rotation and vote this whole story has described, and the fewer bites and gnawed fingers reported below decks this voyage than on ships without one is, by more than one older hand's account, largely down to him. It's a small mercy, easy to overlook, but a functioning rat catcher aboard is worth more to the quality of everyone's actual sleep than half the superstitions this chapter has already described. The tools you develop for coping with all of this are strange, small, and largely undocumented in any formal way, because nobody wrote a manual for how to rest while hunted. You learn them the way sailors have always learnt the unofficial parts of the job, by watching the men around you and stealing whatever seems to work, piece by piece, night by night. Some of it borders on superstition, which makes sense. Sailors of this era, pirate and navy alike, carried a rich, well-documented tradition of maritime superstition, specifically built around controlling an environment that offered almost no real control at all. Whistling aboard ship, in many crews' belief, was thought to invite a storm, and was avoided accordingly, a small, symbolic way of exercising caution over something entirely outside anyone's actual power. Turning a ship's course counter to the sun's path, called widdershins in some traditions, was considered bad luck by superstitious hands. None of these beliefs kept a single navy frigate at bay. What they did do, and this matters more than it might seem to from the outside, is give an exhausted, frightened crew a small sense of agency over an overwhelming situation, a ritual to perform, a rule to follow, a way of feeling like your own careful behaviour mattered to the outcome, even when the actual determining factors were mostly wind, luck, and the skill of whoever was hunting you. Time itself aboard ship was tracked by a small half-hour sandglass, turned by whoever stood watch each time the last grain of sand ran through, and marked by a bell struck in a simple ascending count that told every hand aboard, awake or half asleep, exactly how far into the watch the ship currently stood. It's a strange kind of comfort to describe, given everything else this chapter has already covered about interrupted rest, but it functioned as one all the same, a steady external rhythm that never lied, never sped up out of fear or slowed down out of exhaustion, marking time with the same flat indifference, regardless of whether the watch had been quiet or terrifying. You learn to half hear it in your sleep, the way city dwellers learn to sleep through traffic, present, constant, and eventually so familiar it barely registers, until the night it doesn't ring on schedule, and the sudden absence of that small reliable sound tells you something's wrong before any lookout's shout does. Superstition around women aboard ship is worth a moment's honest correction, because the popular version of pirate lore tends to flatten it into a simple universal taboo, and the documented reality is messier and more interesting than that. Plenty of sailors of this era, pirate and otherwise, did hold to a belief that a woman's presence aboard invited bad luck or discord among the crew. But the historical record includes clear, well-documented exceptions that undercut any claim that the belief was universally observed. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women who sailed and fought as pirates in this same general period, dressed and served alongside male crewmates and were tried, in 1720, for piracy in their own right, proof enough that whatever superstition existed around women at sea, it wasn't strong enough to be an absolute barrier in practice, even if it remained common enough in belief to be worth mentioning at all. It's a useful reminder, tucked into this whole chapter about ritual and belief, that superstition aboard a hunted ship functioned more as a shared story crews told themselves for comfort than as a strict rule anyone actually enforced without exception. There was, on nights when circumstances allowed it, a gentler version of that same instinct at work, a fiddler, when a crew had one aboard, playing low and unhurried below decks after the day's work was done, not for dancing, but simply for the sake of a familiar tune in a place that offered so little else that was familiar. It's a small, easy detail to romanticize, and it's worth resisting that pulls slightly even while including it, because a fiddler's presence aboard depended entirely on circumstance, and survived only as long as the man playing it did. There was nothing guaranteed or ritualized about it, the way the watch rotation or the lights out clause were. But period accounts of pirate ships do mention musicians often enough, and Roberts's own articles allegedly protected their rest specifically, that it's fair to say a bit of music, when it happened, mattered enough to men living this exhausted, hyper-vigilant existence that it was worth writing rules to preserve. The articles helped too, in the more concrete structural way we've already touched on. The lights out clauses, the compensation for injury, the voted watch rotations. But there's a coping mechanism underneath all of that worth naming directly. Trust, built specifically and deliberately through the written, voted on structure of the articles themselves, rather than assumed the way it might be among neighbours in a settled village. A pirate crew wasn't a community bound by years of shared history and mutual obligation the way a fishing village or farming town might be. It was, more often than not, a transient, frequently coerced collection of men from wildly different backgrounds, forced hands, volunteers, freed and escaped enslaved sailors like Cass, deserters from naval and merchant service alike, thrown together by circumstance and held together by exactly one thing: a written, voted-on set of rules everyone had agreed to, that everyone had a hand in enforcing, and that everyone could, in theory, invoke in their own defence, falling asleep in a hammock 14 inches from a man you've known for 4 months, on a ship where a shared vote could depose a captain and a shared article guaranteed you compensation if you lost an arm, required a very specific, structurally earned kind of trust. Not the deep sentimental trust of old friendship, but something more like a contract you'd watched, enforced fairly enough times to. Believe it would hold for you too. On the calmest stretches of open water, far enough from any recent sighting that the captain judged the risk genuinely low, some crews allowed themselves something close to a deliberate, collective exhale, lighter duty for a day, an extra ration, dice and cards permitted openly on deck rather than grudgingly tolerated after lights out below. It wasn't written into any article as a formal entitlement the way the watch rotation or the injury compensation was. It was closer to an unspoken understanding, granted at a captain's discretion when circumstances allowed it, and revoked instantly the moment a lookout's shout suggested they didn't. You learn to treasure those days precisely because of how conditional and rare they are. Not rest guaranteed by the ship's own governing document, but rest offered, briefly, as a kind of gift from a system that otherwise asked almost everything of you and promised comparatively little in return. Rum's role in all of this deserves its own honest accounting, because it cuts in both directions at once. A tot of rum before sleep genuinely did ease the body's aches after a day of hard labour, and there's no dishonesty in saying it helped men rest, who otherwise might not have managed it at all. But rum also dulled reaction time and judgment exactly when a sudden alarm demanded neither, which is very likely why so many surviving sets of pirate articles regulate its consumption rather than leaving it entirely to individual discretion, restricting heavy drinking to daylight hours or requiring anyone continuing to drink past a certain hour to do it up on open deck, away from men trying to actually sleep. It's a small, practical piece of self-governance, voted on by men who understood their own weaknesses well enough to write rules against them in advance. Not every disturbance in that crowded dark comes from outside the ship at all, and it's worth naming honestly rather than skipping past it the way most retellings of this whole story tend to do. Men who have lived for months under the specific compounding weight of interrupted sleep, real danger, and the constant low hum of dread this whole night has been describing do not simply leave that weight behind the moment their eyes close. Period accounts occasionally mention crewmen crying out in their sleep or waking suddenly, disoriented. Convinced for a confused moment that a fight already lost in memory was happening again in the present, the ordinary, well-documented way a body and mind under sustained threat continue processing that threat even in rest. Nobody aboard has a name for it in the terms a modern listener might reach for, and nobody expects it to simply stop. You learn instead a kind of quiet tolerance for it in the men around you, a hand on a shoulder to wake someone gently rather than sharply, an unspoken agreement not to ask too many questions about what exactly they'd been dreaming. Because on a ship where everyone is carrying some version of the same weight, there's very little room and very little need for anyone to pretend otherwise. Toby, the ship's boy who sleeps nearest the magazine, has developed his own small coping ritual over the months you've watched him grow slightly less like a frightened child, and slightly more like the rest of this exhausted crew. He counts the bell strikes under his breath at the start of every watch he's not required to be awake for. A habit he picked up, he says, from an older hand who told him counting gave the mind something to hold on to besides fear. It's not so different when you think about it, from Cass tapping his shell against his teeth, or the older superstitions about whistling and storms, a small private ritual imposed on a situation that otherwise offers no real control at all. Watching a 12-year-old boy invent his own version of the exact same coping mechanism every grown man aboard has quietly built for himself is, depending on the night, either oddly reassuring or the saddest thing you've seen all voyage. Most nights, somehow, it manages to be both at once. The ship's surgeon, a wiry, sharp-tongued forced man named Peter Bramble, who had been serving aboard a merchant vessel before his ship was taken, and his particular skills made him too useful to release, sleeps worse than almost anyone else aboard, and for reasons that have nothing to do with watch rotations. A surgeon's rest belonged to whoever needed him most urgently, day or night, and a crew that fought, fell, and fell ill on no particular schedule meant Bramble's own sleep followed no schedule either. He catches it in fragments, between emergencies, the same broken, rationed way everyone else does, except his fragments are interrupted by other men's crises rather than his own watch bell. He keeps tucked into his own sea chest, a small collection of instruments he maintains with an almost obsessive care, cleaning and checking them by lantern light in whatever spare minutes the ship allows him. Because the alternative, reaching for a dull blade or a fouled needle in an emergency at 2 a.m, isn't one he's willing to risk. There's a particular flavour of dread reserved specifically for the first real sighting of any given voyage, distinct from every false alarm and every practice drill that follows it, and it's worth naming before this chapter moves toward its close. The first time, nobody's reactions are quite worn in yet. The specific calm that months of rehearsed alarms eventually produce hasn't had time to settle into anyone's hands or breathing. You remember your first sighting, weeks into your very first voyage aboard this ship, with a clarity none of the later, more practiced scrambles ever quite matched. The particular cold drop in your stomach, the way your hands shook slightly reaching for a weapon you drilled with a dozen times but never actually needed. That fear never fully disappears across a voyage. It just gets quieter, buried under enough repetition that the body learns to act through it rather than around it. 3 weeks after the near miss with the loose block that woke you falsely, the alarm comes again, and this time it's real, a genuine sighting. A Navy sloop working close along the coast in exactly the kind of weather that makes an approach hard to spot until it's nearly on top of you. The scramble that follows is fast, practiced, and, remarkably, calmer than you might expect from a crew running on months of interrupted sleep, because the drills, the false alarms, the 1,000 small rehearsals of exactly this moment have worn a groove into everyone's reactions deep enough that the body knows what to do even when the mind is still catching up. You outrun the sloop barely into water shallow enough to end the chase, and the relief afterward is different from the relief after a false alarm, heavier, more physical, the specific exhaustion of an adrenaline surge with nowhere left to go. It's in the weeks following that real chase that Cass Okafor, quartermaster, keeper of a worn cowrie shell and a fastidiously lashed hammock, makes the decision that closes out his part of this particular voyage. His share from the last several prizes, combined with the injury compensation from months back, has accumulated to enough that he can, by the crew's own articles and his own accounting, buy himself out of the voyage at the next port and set himself up ashore with something like real security. A rare enough outcome in this trade that it's worth pausing on rather than rushing past. The port where he finally steps off, a small trading settlement where a man with coin and no questions asked about his past can simply become a resident rather than a fugitive, isn't grand or storied. It's just solid, and still, and his. He tells you the night before he leaves, tapping the shell against his teeth one last time, that he intends to sleep, once he's ashore for good, facing away from the water for the first time in longer than he can remember, not because the habit of watching for danger has left him, but because he's finally decided to let it. It's a small, quiet, genuinely hopeful ending, tucked into a story that has spent most of its time in shadow and exhaustion, and it's worth letting it sit exactly there. Proof that the articles, the votes, the shared risk and shared compensation that structured this entire strange, hunted way of life could, for at least one man, actually deliver on what they promised. The morning he leaves, Cass finds you on deck before the ship's boat is even lowered and presses the cowrie shell, the same one he's tapped against his teeth before every uncertain order for the better part of a year, into your palm without much ceremony. "Won't need it where I'm going," he says. Which isn't quite true, and both of you know it, but it's the kind of thing said between men who've shared a crowded gun deck long enough to have run out of better words for what they mean. Toby, the ship's boy, watches from a distance with the particular, unguarded grief of someone too young to have learned yet how to hide it, and Cass ruffles his hair on the way past, a small, unremarkable gesture that will mean considerably more to Toby, you suspect, in the months to come, than it appears to mean to Cass in the moment. Then he's over the rail and into the boat, and the harbour swallows the sound of the oars faster than seems fair, and the ship feels, in some way you can't quite name yet, a little less carefully ordered than it did the night before. Not every crew, and not every pirate, got an ending like that. What survives of the ones who didn't, buried now under 2 centuries of silt and salt water, tells its own final, quieter kind of story. What Cass Okafor chose, a settled bed, faced deliberately away from the water, was a version of rest almost none of his contemporaries got to choose for themselves. For most, the sea decided how the story ended, and in at least one case, it left behind enough evidence, preserved by sand and time, to tell us more about how pirates actually lived and slept than any trial record ever could. On the morning of April 26, 1717, a nor'easter off the coast of Cape Cod does something no Royal Navy squadron ever managed against Samuel Bellamy's flagship, the Wider Galley. It ends her. In minutes, in water barely 30 feet deep, close enough to shore that survivors could, in theory, have walked to land if the storm and the surf had allowed it. Of a crew numbering somewhere between 140 and 180 men, only 2 survived. This is the story of the Wider, the ship, the wreck, and the strange, patient way the sea eventually told this whole chapter's story back to us. Nearly 270 years after it sank, in a stretch of shallow, ordinary-looking coastal water that gave up its secret only when someone finally thought to look hard enough. Bellamy's rise had been fast even by pirate standards, and it's worth understanding briefly before the wreck makes sense as an ending, before the storm becomes the only part of his story anyone remembers. Born in England around 1689, Bellamy arrived in the Americas as a young man with, by most accounts, more ambition than fortune, and turned to piracy in 1716 after failed attempts at treasure salvaging along the Florida coast, the same wrecked Spanish fleet, incidentally, that had drawn Charles Vane's early mentor Henry Jennings into piracy around the same time. One more thread connecting every captain and every crew this long night has followed. Within a year, Bellamy had built a reputation and a growing flotilla substantial enough that, in early 1717, he captured the Wider Galley, a well-built, fast slave ship recently arrived from delivering its human cargo in the Caribbean, and converted her into his flagship, adding guns and refitting her for the exact kind of speed and shallow water maneuverability that defined successful pirate. Operations across this entire era, the same maneuverability that had kept so many other crews in this story a step ahead of their pursuers. By the standards of the trade, Bellamy, reportedly still under 30 years old at the time of his death, was, for a brief window, extraordinarily successful, credited by some estimates with capturing over 50 ships in barely a year of active piracy. A pace that, while smaller in absolute terms than Robert's later career, was remarkable for its speed, a career compressed into months rather than years. Bellamy carried a nickname his contemporaries reportedly used with something closer to affection than fear, the Prince of Pirates, or in some retellings Black Sam, said to have earned a measure of genuine popularity among common sailors for treating captured crews with unusual leniency, and, according to legend recorded well after the fact, offering forced or volunteer recruits a share of plunder more generous than most captains extended. It's worth holding that reputation the same way we've held every other colourful detail in this story. The specific quotable lines of egalitarian rhetoric attributed to Bellamy trace back to Johnson's history rather than to any independently verified source, and should be read as legend adjacent rather than settled fact, the same caution owed to Robert's muddy water quip and Teacher's supposed final words alike. What's more durable, because it survives independently in the structure of his crew's own articles, and in colonial accounts of how his ships operated, is the broader pattern. Bellamy's crew, like so many others in this story, governed itself by vote and by written rule, sharing risk and reward in a way that gave ordinary sailors more say over their own fate than the merchant and naval fleets most of them had come from. A different, gentler kind of legend attaches itself to Bellamy specifically, one worth naming honestly as folklore rather than fact. The story of Maria Hallett, a young Cape Cod woman said to have been Bellamy's sweetheart before he turned to piracy, waiting for him to return with enough fortune to marry respectably, a story that surfaces in local New England tradition long after the fact. With no contemporary documentation to support the specific details usually attached to it, the kind of tale that grows richer with each generation precisely because nobody left behind a record to check it against. Whether any version of that romance was real, the timing local legend assigns it as genuinely poignant regardless. The Wider went down within sight of the same stretch of coastline the story places Hallett on, close enough that, if any part of the tale held even a kernel of truth, Bellamy may have died within a few miles of exactly the shore he was said to be sailing home toward. The Wider wasn't sailing alone that night, and the fate of the smaller vessel travelling with her adds a grim, documented coda to the wreck that's worth including before the storm itself takes centre stage. A supply sloop called the Mary Ann, part of Bellamy's small flotilla, ran aground in the same nor'easter a short distance away, her crew surviving the wreck itself only to be captured shortly afterward by local authorities and transported to Boston for trial. 6 of the Mary Ann's crew were convicted and hanged there later that year, their depositions and trial records surviving today as one of the more detailed first-hand accounts of exactly the kind of forced versus volunteer distinction that has already decided so many fates across this story, men arguing with varying success, that they'd been compelled into Bellamy's crew rather than choosing it freely. It's a smaller, quieter tragedy running alongside the more famous one, easy to lose entirely in the shadow of the Wider's own sinking, but it's a reminder that the storm that ended Bellamy's flagship reached considerably further than the single ship most retellings focus on. The central turning point of Bellamy's story isn't a battle at all, it's weather, which makes it in its own way a fitting close to a chapter that spent this entire voyage treating the Royal Navy as the primary danger, while quietly acknowledging every few segments that the sea itself was very often the more patient and more indifferent threat. In late April 1717, the Wider, now Bellamy's flagship and heavily laden with plunder from a recently captured fleet of merchant vessels, was working up the North American coast when a violent nor'easter overtook her off the outer arm of Cape Cod. Near what is now the town of Wellfleet, Massachusetts, storms of this violence were an accepted, well-understood risk of the trade. Sailors of this era read weather with far more sophistication than popular imagination generally credits them, watching sky colour, wind shifts and swell patterns for warning signs. But a nor'easter arriving fast, at night, off an unfamiliar and treacherously shoaled coastline, could overwhelm even a well-handled ship with very little real warning. The stretch of coast Bellamy was working in the weeks before the storm was itself well-trafficked and well-chosen, part of a pattern of movement up the American seaboard that multiple colonial accounts trace through the early months of 1717. A run of captured merchant vessels off the Bahamas and the Carolinas that had, by the time the Wider turned north toward New England waters, made Bellamy's fleet flush enough with plunder to draw exactly the kind of attention that made continued success increasingly risky. It's worth noting, in the same spirit of resisting easy irony that this whole night has tried to hold on to, Bellamy wasn't fleeing pursuit, or caught unprepared by an enemy the way Roberts or Teach were. He was simply sailing through weather that had nothing to do with the Royal Navy at all, proof that even a captain who'd outthought and outrun every hunter in this story could still lose everything to a threat no amount of watch rotations or shallow anchorages could fully guard against. What eyewitness texture survives comes from the two men who lived to describe it. Thomas Davis, a Welsh carpenter who'd been forced into Bellamy's crew after his own ship was captured, and John Julian, a young man of mixed Native American and African descent whose specific role aboard remains less clearly documented in surviving records. Though he is generally believed to have served in some navigational capacity, drawing on local knowledge of the waters. Davis's later deposition describes the Wider driving hard onto a sandbar in mountainous surf, her mainmast snapping and crashing down across the deck, and the ship essentially disintegrating within minutes as wave after wave broke over her exposed hull, scattering crew, cargo, and wreckage across a wide stretch of shallow water and beach. Most of the crew, weighed down by the very plunder they'd spent the past year accumulating, pockets and clothing reportedly stuffed with coin, by some accounts, in the frantic final minutes, drowned within sight of a shore they could very nearly have reached. The wreck lay largely undisturbed and effectively lost for nearly 270 years, its exact location gradually forgotten, even as local Cape Cod tradition kept a vague half-legendary memory of pirate gold somewhere off Wellfleet alive across generations of local fishermen and townspeople, the kind of story that, without documented evidence to anchor it, easily slides into exactly the same legendary undependable territory as the buried treasure myths surrounding Blackbeard, passed down more as folklore than fact for the better part of 3 centuries. What makes the Wider's story different, and what makes it worth ending on, is that in 1984, underwater explorer Barry Clifford located and began excavating the wreck site, and recovered, among tens of thousands of other artefacts, the ship's bell, cast with the words Wider Galley 1716 clearly legible, providing the first conclusively verified identification of an actual, documented pirate shipwreck anywhere in the world. Every other pirate wreck claimed before or since carries some degree of uncertainty. The Wider, thanks to that single cast bronze bell, does not. It's worth sitting, briefly, with what kind of ship the Wider actually was before Bellamy ever took her. She'd been purpose-built as a slaver, designed and outfitted specifically for the brutal, profitable work of carrying captive people across the Atlantic, and had completed at least one such crossing before Bellamy's fleet captured her on her return voyage, her hold now filled with the ivory. Sugar and indigo taken in exchange for the human cargo already delivered. It's the same uncomfortable thread running through this entire story. the one that first surfaced in this ship's earliest chapter with Cass Okafor's own crossing. Piracy in this era existing in constant, tangled proximity to the slave trade, sometimes offering a genuine, documented path to freedom for individual men taken aboard pirate crews, and just as often simply redirecting the same brutal traffic in goods and people toward a different set of pockets. The wider, converted from one trade into the other, carried that whole uncomfortable history down with her when she sank, and the wreck that historians and archaeologists have spent 4 decades patiently excavating is, in that sense, a monument to both stories at once, inseparable from each other, no matter how the popular version of pirate history prefers to separate them. The moment the bell itself came up, in 1985, is worth pausing on specifically, because it's the single point in this entire long night where legend and documented fact snap cleanly together. Divers had spent months working a debris field that could, without conclusive proof, have belonged to any one of dozens of ships lost along this stretch of treacherous coastline over the centuries. Until the bronze bell broke the surface, its cast lettering still legible after 268 years underwater, and every question about which wreck this actually was simply ended. It's a rare thing in a story built this heavily on caveats and disputed provenance and legend versus documented fact, one object, pulled dripping out of the sand. That settled the matter beyond reasonable argument. What followed wasn't purely a matter of careful science either, and it's worth being honest about that too. The recovered treasure's ownership became the subject of a genuine legal dispute between the salvage company and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, eventually settled through the courts in a way that established the state's claim to a share of future fines while allowing continued excavation to proceed. A reminder that even a wreck this well documented, this conclusively identified, still had to work its way through very modern arguments about who, exactly, gets to keep what the sea gives back after 2.5 centuries. The excavation itself has stretched across 4 decades now, a slow, patient, methodical process that stands in fairly stark contrast to the fast, desperate hours of the ship's actual sinking. A dedicated museum in Provincetown, Massachusetts, now houses a rotating selection of the tens of thousands of recovered artifacts, alongside detailed exhibits walking visitors through the ongoing conservation work. A rare instance in this entire story of the evidence being not just preserved, but made genuinely physically accessible to anyone who wants to stand close enough to see the actual bell, the actual coins, the actual small leather shoe. Divers work the site in conditions shaped as much by New England's shifting sands and unpredictable visibility as by the wreck itself, cataloguing and conserving artifacts that have spent centuries in salt water and require careful, gradual treatment before they can be safely handled or displayed at all. A single recovered cannon can take months of conservation work before it's stable enough to leave a laboratory tank. It's a strange, quiet echo of the exact patience this entire story has kept circling back to, the slow, unglamorous, essential labour that happens between the dramatic moments everyone remembers. What the site has yielded since then, across decades of careful excavation, turns this chapter's entire theme, how pirates actually lived, rested, and were caught unprepared, from something reconstructed out of trial depositions and colonial correspondence into something you can, in a very real sense, hold, examine, and hand to the next visitor waiting behind you in line. Cannons, cutlasses, and thousands of coins from a dozen different nations. Evidence of exactly how far-flung and multinational a pirate crew's plunder, and likely its membership, actually was. Coins minted in Spain, Portugal, England, and the Dutch colonies, all recovered from the same small stretch of seabed. A physical record of just how international a single pirate ship's haul, and by extension its crew, tended to be. Personal items, buckles, a sock, fragments of clothing, small, intimate objects that tie the abstract statistics of the wreck back to individual men who wore and used them. Among the most affecting individual finds is a single leather shoe and a small leg bone, recovered together and believed, based on their size, to belong to a child or very young teenager, plausibly. Researchers have suggested with appropriate caution about certainty. The youngest known member of Bellamy's crew, a boy sometimes identified in secondary accounts as John King, said to have joined the pirates as a child, by choice, after his own family's ship was taken. The specific identification remains debated rather than settled, and it's worth holding that uncertainty honestly rather than presenting it as confirmed. But even held with that caution, the shoe and the bone do something no trial record or ship's article ever quite managed across this entire journey. They make the human scale of this whole hunted, exhausted, precarious life impossible to look away from. Bellamy's death, coming as early as it did in 1717, sits near the front edge of a broader pattern that would define the following 5 years for every crew and every captain this story has followed. An increasingly coordinated, increasingly well-resourced Royal Navy campaign, spurred by mounting pressure from merchants, colonial governors, and the Crown alike, gradually closing the gap that mobility, shallow anchorages, and sheer nerve had exploited for the better part of a decade. Roberts would hold that gap open longer and more successfully than almost anyone, right up until Challoner Ogle finally closed it off Cape Lopez in 1722. But the trend line, viewed across this whole story rather than any single captain's career, points in one direction only, toward an ocean with fewer and fewer places left for a hunted crew to actually rest. The discovery did more than settle one wreck's identity. Before Barry Clifford's team pulled that bell out of the sand, pirate history existed almost entirely in the form this whole night has already leaned on so heavily: trial depositions, colonial correspondence, the disputed and sometimes dramatized pages of Johnson's general history, second-hand and inherently limited by whoever happened to be writing things down at the time. The wider gave the field something categorically different: a physical, datable, conclusively attributed body of evidence that historians and archaeologists could examine directly rather than reconstruct from someone else's account. It helped establish underwater pirate archaeology as a legitimate, rigorous field of its own in the decades since, one that has gone on to identify or investigate other wrecks from this same era with a level of confidence that simply wasn't available before 1984. Every other ship in this story, the Royal Fortune, the Adventure, Vane's wrecked sloop off the Bay Islands, still exists for us only in the written record. The wider exists, at least in part, in glass cases you can walk up to and look at directly. This is the story of the wider, the ship that outran nothing that night, caught not by a Navy frigate or a clever lieutenant's ambush, but by weather no crew of that era could have reliably predicted or escaped in time. And the wreck that, nearly 3 centuries later, finally let historians and archaeologists reconstruct, artifact by careful artifact, exactly how these men had actually lived while running. Every theme this whole night has moved through: the watch rotations, the shallow anchorages, the crowded hammocks, the articles that govern sleep and compensation and trust among men who'd often known each other only months, sits now in climate-controlled museum cases in Provincetown and Yarmouth, Massachusetts, available to anyone willing to stand in front of the glass and look. There's a version of wonder that belongs specifically to this kind of discovery, and it's worth landing on deliberately before this chapter and this whole long night comes to a close, the strange, genuine privilege of getting to know, in this much physical, tactile detail, exactly how a group of hunted, exhausted, remarkably organised men once tried to survive and to rest, in a world that offered them almost no margin for either. Every wreck like this one that future divers still might find carries the same quiet possibility. Another bell, another name conclusively settled, another crowded gun deck's worth of ordinary human routine, pulled up out of the sand for someone patient enough to go looking. Cass Okafor made it ashore, in the end, to a bed he could finally sleep in, facing away from the water. Bartholomew Roberts went over the side of his own ship, waited, into the Atlantic he'd spent 3 restless years outrunning. Charles Vane hung above a quay named for the guns that once guarded it, left visible from the water as a warning to every crew still weighing whether to keep running. Edward Teach's head came down off Robert Maynard's bowsprit after a night of drink and company cost him the one advantage he'd spent his whole career cultivating. And somewhere off Wellfleet, on a stretch of Cape Cod coastline you can still walk today, a boy's shoe and a boy's shin bone rested in the sand for nearly 300 years, waiting for someone patient enough to come looking. That's the thing about all of this, about the watch rotations and the shallow anchorages, the 14 inches of canvas between one man's shoulder and the next, the articles that promised compensation for a lost arm and demanded the candles be out by a certain hour. None of it was really about comfort. It was about survival stretched thin across months and years, about a hunted, exhausted, remarkably organised group of people finding whatever small, structural, hard-won ways they could to actually rest inside a life that offered almost no safety at all, and, more often than popular memory tends to credit them for, succeeding at it. At least for a while, at least for some of them. You're not on that ship. You never were. You're here, warm, still, in a bed that has never once needed to be anchored in 8 feet of water to keep you safe from anything at all. Nobody is going to shake your shoulder in the next 4 hours and tell you a sail's been sighted. The only tide pulling at you tonight is sleep itself, patient and unhurried, and entirely, finally, yours to keep. You're warm. You're still. You're safe. And no one is coming for you tonight. That's enough. That's more than enough. Sleep now.